Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Faked His Death for 3 years? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Katsuki thought his life was going to be so much easier when he started UA. He would finally be able to just put all of his focus on becoming a hero and not have to deal with all of the extra shit. He'd been looking forward to 3 years of putting his nose to the grindstone and only coming up to breathe when he graduated and had his license. Sure, his therapist was a little concerned by how convinced that was going to be the case he was, but it was fine. He was fine, so long as he got to leave most of the bullshit behind. And then the FING League of Villains happened. And then the sports festival went sideways fast thanks to Half and Half. And then Stain almost killing one of their classmates because he was stupid enough to go into a fight without backup. All of it leading up to the F'd up situation he was in now, chained to a chair in a musty-smelling bar surrounded by villains. A part of him registered the bullshit coming from the leader's mouth, but the rest of him almost refused to believe that this was his shitty lot in life. This was the exact opposite of every expectation he'd had at the beginning of the year. Or for his life in general. A quiet voice in the back of his mind unhelpfully reminded him that he didn't even know if most of his classmates were alive right now, and it was all his fault that this had happened. He hated that voice most of all. Scratch that, he hated the BSRD in front of him most of all. Shigaraki was droning on and on about how perfect he'd be as a villain and how it would be such a blow to UA, and all Katsuki wanted to do was punch him in the face till he swallowed his teeth. Katsuki's lip was curled up in a snarl, hands curling into claws within the confines of his shackles. A villain? Not a FING chance. He had too much riding on being a hero. Too many things to atone for. Before he could spit venom at the silver-haired moron, though, the door of the bar was thrown open with enough force to rattle the frame. All of the assembled villains immediately were on the alert as a figure stormed into the room, stopping just inside the door and letting their eyes roam around the area. None of the villains attacked as they were sized up, most of them relaxing a little as if they knew the person. So another villain. Lovely. The snarl on his lips, though, froze completely when those eyes fell on him. A familiar shade of green. Duller than he'd ever seen it, but familiar nonetheless. And FING impossible. His mouth hung open uselessly as he took in the sight of the kid he'd grown up with and had mourned for the past 2.5 years. His hair was shorter, the sides almost shaved, and he was a little bit taller than the last time Katsuki had seen him. There was also a deep, dark rage simmering under the surface of his gaze. The way he held himself screamed that he was ready to spring into action at any moment, hands curling and uncurling at his sides as those green eyes lingered on him. Deku breathed out, shifting in his seat to turn himself more towards the familiar stranger. The teen shook himself out of whatever thoughts he was having, hands disappearing into the folds of his large, dark hoodie as he whirled back to face the leader of the League of Villains without answering Katsuki. Panic shot through Katsuki as he stalked towards the silver-haired man. All his mind's eye could conjure was the picture of Aizawa during the USJ attack, broken and unconscious in a crater. Said panic was replaced as his world once again flipped on his head as the green-haired teen pulled a knife out of his sleeve and hurled it directly at Shigaraki's face. The only thing that saved the man-child was the warp gate user intervening, the knife appearing a moment later out of a gate near the teen's feet and embedding in the wood of the floor. "Are you effing stupid?" The teen snarled, reaching back into his sleeve for what Katsuki assumed was another knife. "First USJ and now this? Really? I knew Stain didn't join up with you. You don't have 2 brain cells to rub together." Katsuki could have sworn the teen's eyes shifted towards the scared face BSDRD's direction, and he stored the info away for later, still too off balance to do much more than watch the situation escalating in front of him. Shigaraki was snarling as he stalked closer to Deku, hands outstretched. Deku seemed more than willing to brawl with him, only stopped by the warp gate that had sprung up between them that was keeping them from meeting in the middle of the bar. Stain wanted Hero Society to fall, and so do I. That's all you need to know. Shigaraki yelled, trying to sidestep the gate only to have it follow him. When this kid joins up with us, it'll show them all that it's all better off crumbling to dust. The green-haired teen let out a bark of a laugh, face twisted with an emotion that Katsuki had never seen on the other's face the entire time he'd known him. He couldn't pinpoint it was, but the base emotion flashing in those green eyes was rage. Murderous rage. Katsuki didn't doubt that if the warp gate wasn't between the two, one of them would be bleeding by now. He wasn't sure if he was happy about that or not. Especially when he wasn't sure who exactly would come out on top of that fight, if he was being completely honest. You did no research for this, did you? Deku laughed, the sound so far removed from the laugh Katsuki remembered that it made him flinch a little against his chair. It was so dark. All you saw was the way he acted at the sports festival and just decided right off the bat that he'd be perfect without looking into anything else. God, you don't even know what you've done. You're lucky that the entirety of UA hasn't descended on you by now. Deku carefully lunged to the side, snarling a little when the warp gate moved with him as it had with Shigaraki. Even if he doesn't join, it will be a blow to the heroes to have one of their prized students snatched away. Even now the sheep out there are starting to see how useless their precious heroes are. Shigaraki snarled. Either way, he's useful for changing this disgusting society we live in. Do you even effing hear yourself spouting this bullshit, or are you just that stupid? Deku snarled right back, once again trying to duck around the gate between them. What exactly are you going to do when the heroes fall? Step in and restructure society? You don't have any kind of plan, and all you'll find from your way of going about this is dust and chaos. The crusty BSter didn't seem to have an answer for that, instead reduced to just growling incoherently and trying to shove his hands through the warp gate. Such a lively reintroduction to our base, Deku. How wonderful. Everyone in the bar froze, though, as a new voice spoke up. The tone was pleasant, but there was something about it that made Katsuki's stomach twist violently. The way the villains seemed to turn to face the TV was also another huge red flag to the teen, even if he hadn't seen the way Deku's face had paled. From where he was sitting, Katsuki could see the way Deku's fingers tightened around the hilt of his knife. He could see the way his knuckles were white and how the blade shook a little as if the teen's hand was shaking. No one spoke in answer, Shigaraki seeming to calm and the rest of the villains seemingly holding their breath to see how this new development played out. This had to be the boss that was controlling everything, Katsuki thought to himself absently. That crusty BSRD obviously took his cues from whoever this BSRD was. Kurogiri, bring Deku to me. It's been so long since we had a chat. I'm so curious about where he's been. Katsuki could see the blood drain even further from the other teen's face, and he felt dread build up in his own stomach. If Deku left, would Katsuki ever be able to track him down again? He began to struggle against his chains as Deku seemed to droop in defeat, knife disappearing into the sleeve of his hoodie once more. The almost violent sound of his chains rattling seemed to remind Deku that he was still there, green eyes once more swinging around to pin him in place. The rage had been replaced with a sort of resignation, to the situation or to something else Katsuki couldn't tell. Even while he wished to never break eye contact with the other teen again, his stomach twisted uncomfortably at just how dull and closed off his gaze was. What had happened in the last 2 years? None of this made any sense to Katsuki. Think about what I said, Kaken. Deku said finally, his tone sharp and angry. Shigaraki is an idiot with no foresight. All he can offer is chaos and death. Deku, no! Katsuki yelled, struggling against his shackles still as Deku turned away from him and walked towards the warp gate. The teen didn't look back at him, even as he continued to scream his name, and vanished into the swirling mist of the warp gate. Silence fell onto the bar once more. Once the gate closed, all eyes swinging to the blonde teen once more as he slumped down into his chair. The scarred Bizardi had an odd, pinched look on his face that set Katsuki's teeth on edge. He was distracted from it, though, as the creepy chick bounced towards him with her knife in her hand. Kaken, can I call you that? I'm going to call you that. She cooed, giggling madly when he snapped at her and shifted as far away as possible. The rest of the villains seemed to relax and he snarled at them as they shifted closer once more. Let him out of his restraints, Dobby. How can we show him we're serious if he's locked up like an animal? Shigaraki drawled, seeming to pull himself together once more now that Deku had exited. We have so much to discuss. There were a lot of things Izuku wanted to say to Kaken before he stepped through that portal. It's okay, the heroes will be here soon. I'm sorry for not coming home. It wasn't your fault. None of which he could say with the entirety of the league watching him. Not when the boogeyman could hear him. There was no telling what either of them would do if they knew who Katsuki was to him. Shigaraki probably would kill him in front of Izuku just to take one more thing from him. To prove that he could finally hurt the thorn in his side. No, none of the league could find out how badly Izuku wanted to have Bakugo Katsuki out of that bar and back on his way to UA. The entire situation was dangerous and volatile in ways Izuku was not prepared to handle at the moment. Mentally shaking himself from his thoughts, he focused on the task at hand. All for one wanted to chat. Sticking his shaking hands in the pockets of his overlarge hoodie, he forced himself to focus. Taking a deep breath, he stepped through the warp gate and into the familiar room where his biggest nightmare resided. The man himself was relaxed, leaning back in his chair as if everything were a mildly interesting show on the TV. Which, Izuku supposed, was true for the 200-year-old monster sitting in front of him. The villain had on more than one occasion told Izuku how boring he found the routine squabbles of heroes and villains once he'd seen them a few hundred times. Izuku swallowed his anxiety at the sight of the man, fighting down the urge to take a step back when his head turned from the direction of the TV set monitoring the bar to where he stood. It had been months since Izuku had stood in this room and he had no idea if the man had added new quirks to his arsenal or not. It was always a safe bet to assume he had, honestly. Deku, how good to see you. All for one hummed, leaning his chin on his fist. At least he seemed amused instead of angry. It's been so long. What have you been doing, If you asked Izuku how he'd ended up having chats with the biggest boogeyman of the underworld, he honestly could not tell you the exact sequence of events. It seemed like he was just a simple information broker one minute and then next. He'd been swept into a warp gate and into the lair of the beast. A monster that seemed amused by him more often than not. Even when he fought with his prized student. Izuku honestly could say he hated Shigaraki more than he thought possible. He was everything Izuku despised. Stupid. Cruel. Childish. Too short-sighted to see anything past his shallow want to hurt and destroy. Their very first interaction had shown him as much as he needed to see of the silver-haired man, and he'd been very vocal about his dislike ever since. It didn't matter to all for one though. He seemed a little disappointed that they didn't get along, but in the long run had seemed to be content with just talking to Izuku about his opinions on things and how the world ran. Which was disturbing to the teen. Because it gave him way too much of an insight into how all for one thought and how he planned. That monster's mind was not something Izuku wanted to know, and the fact that he did was the source of some of his worst nightmares. Chiding himself for getting lost in his head again, Izuku shrugged a little and rocked forward a little on the ball of his feet. Trying to lay low, honestly. He answered evenly, betraying none of his nerves at being stuck in front of his man when he'd never had any intention of ever stepping foot in this place again. As always, something made harder by your psychotic protege out there. All for one laughed, amused by the dislike evident in the teen's tone. Of course, but Tamura has big plans that I'm sure you'll be interested to see play out. He's come along quite nicely. It's a shame you haven't been here to see it. The man's tone was amused, almost proud even, and it made Izuku's stomach roll with anxiety. It was rarely a good thing for someone like him to be so jovial. So, what do you think of his current plan? Do you think the young hero out there will switch sides? Izuku had to fight back the urge to snap at the idea of it, already knowing this little plan came from Shigaraki himself. It reeked of the stupidity of the villain. I don't think he will. His convictions are too strong. Izuku said after a moment of struggling to keep the rage out of his voice and posture. It was simmering under the surface, but he couldn't let it out. Not now. Not here. It would raise too many questions. Shigaraki only saw how unnecessarily aggressive he was during the sports festival and didn't look any further into why that might have been the case. All for One let out a small hum of approval and leaned further back in his throne, face moving back towards the screen showing the bar where Izuku could see Katsuki unchained and causing problems. A part of him wanted to grin, but he suppressed it, knowing that while the man couldn't see, he would somehow be able to sense it. I came to the same conclusion when Tamura told me of his idea. However, it is an improvement and I would never want to discourage that in the boy. It was almost as if the man was speaking to himself for a moment before he shook his head. No matter, the boy will serve a purpose to us one way or the other. Which brings me to why I am so glad to see you today. I have a proposition for you. Ice slid down Izuku's spine as the man sat forward in his throne, a grin spreading across his face underneath the breathing mask he wore. Never had those words boded well for anyone in Izuku's experience. Especially not coming out of the mouth of one of the literal devils of the world. When Izuku didn't speak, couldn't really, the man laughed and continued on. He motioned towards the TV with one hand, bringing Izuku's attention back to the scene playing out in the bar. As I said, he can serve a purpose one way or the other. Tamura will likely kill him once he continues to refuse to join and makes a mess, but I could have another use for him. The man turned back to face Izuku. Cold dread filled Izuku's stomach at the phrasing of his words. You could have another use for him. It would be poetic justice, don't you think? I could give you the quirk that caused you so much heartache and pain in your childhood and leave the boy quirkless. Just deserts. What he deserves. Izuku jerked as if he had been slapped by the words, taking a step back almost instinctively. All for One knew. Somehow this monster knew who he was. Knew the biggest secret he'd tried to hide and bury for the last 2.5 years. Suddenly all he wanted to do was throw up, his stomach revolting at the idea of how much this man could know about him already if he knew about Kaken's bullying. Oh yes, Midoriya Izuku, I know who you are. Have for quite some time. All for One said this like he was talking about the weather or a passing interesting piece of gossip. Izuku hunched in on himself and tried not to cry. What do you say? I could have Kurogiri bring him here right now and you would have what you've always wanted. A quirk that you could use however you like. A quirk that would come with so much anguish. Even just the thought of taking Kaken's quirk for his own made him want to vomit again. Even if he did want to take from his childhood friend, from his former tormentor, the entire process would put him even more under All for One's thumb. Something he'd been careful to avoid up until this point. Any resources he used or borrowed were paid for with information. He'd purposely never put himself in a place of owing the man in front of him a goddamn thing. But if he was to take a quirk from him, he'd be bound to the man for probably the rest of his miserable life. No. Absolutely not. Izuku grit out, taking another step back and towards the door he knew was hidden along the wall. Screw this. He'd find a way to get Kaken out of that bar, but he was not staying here a moment longer than he absolutely needed to. He was not going to be a puppet for this man. All for One just laughed at him, the sound awful as he turned and ran for the door. He made no move to stop him, instead sinking back into his throne with a satisfied smile. I look forward to our next chat, Izuku. He called at the retreating teenager's back, laughing at how it made him run all the harder. Izuku burst out of the room and into the warehouse, trying his best not to look into the tanks of Nomu that stretched across most of the space. He didn't let himself think, didn't let himself do anything other than run. It wasn't until he was out of the warehouse that he let himself stop and his revolting stomach get what it wanted. He leaned against the side of the building and vomited up everything that had been in his stomach. It was only then that he let the entire situation sink in. The League had Kaken, and would probably kill him once they figured out his convictions, would never for a second let him become a villain. All for One knew who he was. He knew his history. Knew what Kaken was to him, at least on the surface. The man probably knew where his mother was and every single detail about his life for the past few years. The heroes were coming soon. The press conference was oddly timed to begin with when they announced it, but Izuku's gut told him it would be some kind of diversion. Either for the heroes to go in and save Kaken or to give false information. Letting out a shaky breath, Izuku leaned his whole body weight onto the building and fought the urge to slide down it and have a tiny bit of a breakdown. He deserved it, he thought. But he couldn't do that. He needed to either get as far away from All for One as possible or find his way back to the bar to see if he could get Kaken out. Pushing himself back to his feet, he froze when the sounds of shuffling reached his ears from the alleyway beside the warehouse. Was All for One sending a Nomu after him? No, all of the current Nomu were too big for that cramped alleyway. His mind raced as he inched closer and closer to the opening of the alley. Instead of coming face to face with a monster or a villain, Izuku came face to face with 4 UA hero students. They spotted him at the same time he recognized them, terror creeping up their faces as they realized they'd been caught. How had they even found this place? No one except for the League knew about this operation. Who are you? Pulling himself from his thoughts, he frowned at the brown-haired girl that addressed him. She looked like, even within the tight quarters of the alley, she was ready to fight him on the spot. He couldn't help but roll his eyes at her as he took a step back away from the mouth of the alleyway and held up his hands. Shouldn't I be asking you that? Why are 4 Hero Corps students skulking about a warehouse in the middle of the night? He drawled, trying to muster up enough sass to not let them think they had the upper hand here. He had better things to do than babysit some kids who thought they could do whatever they pleased. They never got the chance to answer him. The ground felt like it was shaking as something collided with the front of the warehouse and Izuku reached for the building to steady himself. It looked like the heroes were here after all. Aizawa Shoyuta was a lot of things. Patient was usually one of them. You had to be when dealing with teenagers. Especially dealing with 1A. An ounce less of patience on his part and he might have expelled them all already. After tonight he might just do it anyway. His patience has run its course at the moment, though. He doesn't have even an ounce of it left. Not when he's already had to deal with the media and watch the quite frankly horrific battle between All Might and All for One. Not when after waiting what felt like all night, he finally got word that his student was confirmed safe and in police custody. Along with word that at least 4 of his other students had shown up at the police station with him. Expulsions were on the horizon, he could practically feel it. Which is why he did not complain once when Hisashi demanded he drive him to the station, stating that Shoyuta was in no state to do it himself. That was bullshit and Hisashi knew it. The blonde just wanted an excuse to go with him instead of staying home and waiting for a phone call that Bakugo was unharmed. Shoyuta didn't call him on it. Instead acquiesced to the decision and wisely kept his mouth shut at the speed his husband used getting them to their destination. In return, his husband didn't say a word to him about how he practically tucked and rolled out of the car once they did arrive at the station. Hisashi would later complain that he hadn't even slowed down yet before Shuta's door was open and the underground hero was gone. Shoyuta hadn't even opened the door yet when he heard the yelling. It sounded like Bakugo was having a fit about something and there were several voices answering his. The hero didn't even pause or slow his stride as he moved towards the door and threw it open. If he paused for just a second to soak in the fact that Bakugo barely even had a scratch on him and let himself feel relieved over it, that was between him and whatever deity was watching over him. Hearing the door open, the blonde teenager turned to face him with a wild look on his face. Seeing who it was, he took several strides away from the officers that were blocking his way from wherever he was trying to go and latched onto Shuta's sleeve. "Sensei, you have to make them let him go. He didn't do anything. They're holding him without cause." The explosive teen ground out, knuckles white from the strength of his grip on the older man. That was definitely not something he was expecting to hear out of the teenager's mouth. His eyes flickered away from his student and to the officers for a moment, all of which looked apologetic and as confused as Shoyuta was beginning to feel. Luckily for his sanity, Detective Tsukachi pushed his way past the officers and beckoned Shoyuta to follow him. As he did, Bakugo trailed after him with a thunderous look on his face. When the detective turned around to see that he'd followed, he sighed and Shoyuta had to wonder what exactly had happened in the time it took for him to get to the station for the man to be put out already by the teen. "Bakugo came to the station a little after sunrise with several of your students." The detective started, handing over the file in his hands. Shoyuta was definitely expelling some students DMN. The man's next words, though, pushed the already fuming thoughts out of his brain for a moment. He was also dragging a known and wanted criminal with him. Bullshit. Deku is not a DMN criminal. The teen exploded, finally letting go of his teacher to let his palms spark. Something he only did, Shoyuta noticed, when he was stressed these days. This, Deku, Midoriya Izuku, is a ranked villain. Tsukachi raised his voice over the teens, brows pinched as he ignored Bakugo in favor of staring Shoyuta down like this was all his fault. We're holding him currently until we decide what to do. Decide what to do? He hasn't done shit. He helped me escape those BS's. Bakugo yelled again, taking a step towards the detective before Shuta's hand shot forward to grab him by the back of the shirt. This was obviously a strange occurrence. Ranked villains weren't exceedingly rare, but it was rare for a department not to send them to the commission immediately to be dealt with. Tsukachi, seeing the quirked brow Shoyuta sent his way, sighed and rubbed a hand through his hair. It's not complicated with Midoriya. We know he wasn't involved with the kidnapping, it's a known fact that he'd rather cut Shigaraki into pieces than help him, and we're pretty sure he helped Bakugo escape. Hell, he's given the department info before seemingly just to help. The man glanced uneasily towards the hallway the officers were still guarding. But the commission wants him. But he's just a kid and I'm at a loss for what to do here. Shoyuta stared down at the file in his hands, flipping it open for the first time to see the picture of a smiling preteen staring back up at him. The words underneath his picture, though, drew his eyes next. Presumed dead. Suicide at age no body recovered. Shoyuta let his eyes close briefly, closing the file and finally letting go of Bakugo. He had hoped that this was going to be an easy in, easy out kind of thing. Make sure the kid was okay, escort him home, and then go pass out for the next couple of days. I'll call Nizu and see what we can do. The unsaid, before the commission finds out he's here, was loud and clear, though, by the way Tsukachi's shoulders relaxed a little. Bakugo, go with present Mike and call your parents to let them know you're alive. At least the teen had the sense to look a little guilty at that before he turned to walk back towards the entrance of the station where Hizashi was waiting. Izuku Midoriya was not anything like how Shoyuta expected him to be. Honestly, he wasn't sure what to expect considering how thin the file on him was that Tsukachi was able to put together. All the file told him was that the kid was quirkless and had presumably committed suicide 2.5 years prior. His things had been found on a local bridge along with a note. However, no body ever surfaced from the river, and since it was just another quirkless kid, no one ever bothered to look any further than the note and his things. The Midoriya in front of him no longer looked like the child in the file either. Gone was the wide smile, replaced with a carefully blank mask. His hair was cut close to his head on the sides, wild curls left to grow on top. The overlarge hoodie he'd been wearing when he was arrested had been confiscated, along with an almost frightening amount of knives. This left more of the teen exposed than he seemed comfortable with, Shoyuta thought. His hands and arms were covered in scars as far up as Shoyuta could see. The t-shirt he was wearing was too big on his small frame, slipping a little down his shoulder to reveal a scar against his collarbone that looked almost like a handprint. The kid sitting cuffed to the table in front of him was nothing like he expected, yes. But he suspected that the kid wasn't exactly expecting Shoyuta and Nizu to walk through the door to speak with him either. The momentary flash of surprise that flickered through those green eyes was filed away in Shuta's brain for later examination. Midoriya clearly knew who they were at first glance, which was interesting. The kid's eyes also lingered on him for a moment longer before focusing on Nizu. Interesting. What do I owe the pleasure of a personal visit from Principal Nizu himself? Midoriya rasped, apparently trying to keep his tone level and hide away all of the anxiety he was feeling. The kid was good at hiding it, true, but he couldn't erase the signs completely. Not when Shoyuta could see the areas of the kid's fingers that looked like they'd been picked raw during the time the kid had been alone in the room. Or the fact that his knee was subtly bouncing under the table in an attempt to exercise some of the anxious energy out of himself. The kid was definitely good enough to hide most of the signs from, say, the common street thug or someone like Shigaraki. But he wasn't good enough to hide them from someone who dealt with anxious and unpredictable teenagers day in and day out. He couldn't fool Shoyuta. I had to meet one of the youngest ranked villains in the country in person when I found out you were here. Nizu trilled, walking across the tabletop to stop right in front of the teenager, paws clasped behind his back. You must be very smart to have garnered such attention by just knowing too much, young man. The teen's brows furrowed a little, clearly confused and off balance. Shoyuta held back a snort at the growing bewilderment of the teenager in front of them. This was clearly not the way the kid had thought today was going to. I don't think I follow. Midoriya said finally, eyes flickering uneasily between the two of them. Nizu just laughed and clapped his hands happily, swaying on his feet in a way that only ever meant a headache for Shoyuta. We both have problems that need to be solved, Midoriya Izuku. You, presumably, don't want to go to prison for the rest of your life just because you know more than the average thug and I need help keeping my students safe from one Shigaraki Tamura. I think we can find a mutually beneficial solution here. Nizu let the words hang in the air for a moment, his grin taking on a feral glint as he moved to lean into the teen's space. Midoriya, to his credit, didn't flinch away from him and met the Chimera's gaze evenly. What do you say, my boy? Unless, of course, you want to rot in whatever place the commission decides to send you to once they find out you're here? No, sir, I think we can come up with something that will work. Shoyuta watched the teen lean forward into Nizu's space and reached out one of his cuffed hands for a handshake, a feral light in his eyes shining bright in his eyes to rival Nizu's own. At that moment, not for the first time in his career, Shoyuta wondered exactly what he'd signed up for when he'd agreed to teach under Nizu. He trusted the rat, but gods did he wonder if the principal planned things for the sake of chaos alone. When Izuku pictured how rescuing Kaken from the League was going to go, he was prepared for things to go sideways quickly. They always did when his luck met Shigaraki's particular brand of stupidity. However, he did not expect things to go this far sideways. Not in a million years did he ever expect to be standing on the Uda campus watching Eraserhead putter around a small apartment with two cats following him, yelling for food. He let himself drop down onto the sofa in the living area and watched the entire thing with wide eyes. The whole situation was bizarre, honestly. Sure, when Nizu had said, "Come protect my students from Shigaraki and I'll keep you from disappearing quietly at the hands of the commission," he knew rationally that he'd end up at UA at some point, but no, at no point did he really think he'd end up here. He was still half expecting some shadow government agent to come swooping out of nowhere and grabbing him up. Look, you didn't get to be as good at information gathering as he had without making some enemies. Knowledge was power after all. But honestly, what was he going to do with the information? It wasn't like the public was going to believe that the commission had groomed and abused a top 10 hero since childhood when it came from the mouth of a quirkless nobody. But apparently even knowing about the program in question was too dangerous in their eyes. Bullshit is what it was. Shaking himself out of that depressing thought process, he turned his eyes back towards the underground hero currently trying to caffeinate. Eraserhead glared down at the cats at his feet, stepping over them with practiced ease as he moved towards the coffee pot. From the bags under his eyes, Izuku would hazard a guess that the man had gotten between 0 and none hours of sleep since the whole League ordeal had begun. The little apartment was silent for the most part, aside from the noise of the cats and the man in the kitchen, so Izuku let himself relax back onto the sofa with a small sigh. They were on the ground floor of the newly built 1A dorms, presumably so Eraserhead could keep an eye on the students during the night without sacrificing his own privacy. Students that Izuku was going to have to meet very soon. A tiny bit of anxiety curled at his gut at the thought of it. It wasn't often these days that he interacted with people his own age, and the glaring difference in their life experience was going to be pretty obvious to all of them once the situation was explained. Not to mention what they'd think of him once they found out he was quirkless. No, he didn't have high expectations for how this entire experience was going to go honestly. The shuffling footsteps of the adult whose sofa he was sitting on drew him out of his thoughts, gaze lifting to the man once more as he made his way back into the room and set his coffee down on the table between them before dropping into the chair positioned across from Izuku. He didn't immediately look at him, instead focusing on the file he'd brought with him. He laid it on the coffee table and flipped it open, and Izuku caught a glimpse of his own face. "So, Midoriya, I have a few questions for you before we go over what you're going to be doing here. They're mostly for me, to better gauge how much you can handle right now and what we need to work on." He-Man rumbled, still not looking at Izuku as he reached for his coffee. We have a therapist on staff who we can make an appointment for you with a little bit later on, but with classes starting in a couple days, I need some of these answers immediately. The man looked up then and met the teenager's bewildered gaze. Only breaking eye contact with Izuku once, he nodded his understanding. I'd be more comfortable if you just called me Izuku. The teen mumbled out, glancing away from the adult to stare at the cat that was now perched at his feet. Midoriya was his mother. Midoriya was his father. Izuku didn't want to associate himself with that name ever again. The underground hero didn't say anything but marked down the request before flipping to the questions he'd prepared. Okay, Izuku. Since we're going to be in close proximity together, call me Aizawa. The hero met his gaze once more to confirm with him before looking back down at the paper. I need to know what you've been doing for the past 2.5 years. The police didn't actually have a lot of information on you. The teen nodded, fingers fiddling with the sleeves of his hoodie nervously. He'd been very careful during his career to make sure as few people as possible had any info on him at all. As far as he knew, only 2 total people knew everything. Seeing the teen's nod, the hero sat up a little bit and set aside the paper. It wasn't like there was much useful information on it, anyway. Where did you go after you faked your death? Izuku couldn't stop his leg from bouncing at the question, hands disappearing into his hoodie once more. He didn't have any of his knives, of course, but it was a comfort thing at this point. One that he was sure the hero in front of him picked up on. Technically I didn't fake my death. I fully intended on dying that night. Izuku ignored the way Aizawa's eyes were honed in on his face, fully willing to ignore the troubled expression on the adult's face. Someone pulled me out of the river, and by the time I was coherent enough to correct the assumption, everyone had already written me off as gone. I just figured it was easier to let sleeping dogs lie, you know? The teenager fiddled with his sleeves, carefully avoiding the adult's gaze, growing more and more restless as the silence that followed his words stretched on and on. It felt like forever before Aizawa drew in a deep breath and leaned forward, trying to catch the other's gaze. You thought it was better to let your mother think you were dead? There was something lingering in the teacher's words that Izuku couldn't quite put his finger on. The man didn't sound angry at least, but rather, hurt? Worried maybe. Which made no sense because there was nothing to worry about. Not anymore at least. I mean, I made her life worse just by being born, you know? As it was, I didn't see her very often because of how much she had to work, so I didn't think she'd be very upset to see me go. He did look up after that statement because of the noise that Aizawa made, low and angry like one of the cats Izuku used to feed in the alley behind his safe house. Aizawa wasn't looking at him, though. He was scribbling something into the notepad of questions. Izuku's first instinct was to think that the man was upset with him, but the man's body language said otherwise. Upset for him? But that was ridiculous. This was the reality a lot of homeless kids went through. Surely an underground hero like Eraserhead had run across parents like Midoriya Inko before? Izuku had met his fair share of people with stories like his. Anyway, kid, there is more wrong with that entire statement than I have time to unpack right now. We'll be sure to discuss it with her when we contact her. Contact her? Absolutely not. You can't. The words exploded out of him without his consent, eyes wide and panicked as he leaned across the coffee table to grab Aizawa's sleeve. She can't know. Just leave it, please. It was an irrational reaction, he knew, but he couldn't go back into that house. Not after all these years, and absolutely not after everything that had happened. It would feel too much like becoming that stupid, useless Deku all over again. Knowing his mother, she'd wrap him in bubble wrap and make sure he never left her side again. Or, even worse, what if she didn't actually care like everyone had suggested over the years? He couldn't handle the unknown right now. You're a minor, we're going to have to inform her at some point. The adult tried to argue logic, brows furrowed at the teen's reaction. A minor who is still legally dead. You don't have to tell her jack shit. Izuku tried for logic and overshot it into hysterical. He knew, though, that his reaction was giving the older man pause. Please don't tell her. I can't go back there. He could tell he'd won the argument when Aizawa's shoulders slumped and he rubbed his hand over his eyes. Only when he nodded did Izuku relax and release his wrist, retreating back onto his sofa and curling up into a tight ball. Boy, was this a hell of a get-to-know-you conversation. Fine, kid, but I have another question you're not going to like. Who pulled you from the river? No, Aizawa was not going to like that answer, and Izuku didn't really want to get thrown to the commission so soon. You have to work with me here, kid. I can't help if I don't know key details. Diamond the adult and his logic. Curling up tighter into himself, he peeked at the man over the tops of his knees. You know him as Dabi, he said shortly, glancing away from the hero before he could see the look on his face. He must have seen me jump and pulled me out. On top of that, he used a shit ton of favors with a local healer to keep me alive and speed up my healing. Aizawa was going to be able to read between the lines, he knew. Never in his entire life was Izuku going to be able to pay that kind of act back. Even if Dabi refused to talk about it or even mention it after that day, Izuku literally owed the man his life. Even more so for everything he did for him after the fact. Did you know about the attack on the summer camp beforehand? Izuku decidedly did not flinch from the ice in the hero's tone. Nope. He didn't care what anyone thought of him or his past. This was a means to an end, that was all. I did not. We had a falling out when he joined the league and I haven't spoken to him since. He said shortly, still refusing to lift his eyes and meet the other's gaze. He wanted me to join with him and I refused to have anything to do with Shigaraki and his boogeyman of a mentor. There was a shuffling of paper as the man wrote something down and the room was otherwise silent for a moment. Do you know his or the league's whereabouts now? The ice was gone from the man's voice, replaced by something Izuku couldn't and didn't have the energy to place. No. Do you not know, or are you just unwilling to tell me? Izuku lifted his gaze at that to glare at the man, fury igniting and blazing behind the green of his eyes for the first time since meeting the pro hero. No. He bit out, fingers curling into fists around the fabric of his pants. If I had any info on Shigaraki, I'd tell you and let the Biasu rot in Tartarus. I'd rat out the whole league if I had any information to give. He met Aizawa's gaze steadily, searching for whatever the man was trying to gain from this line of questioning. There was a flash of satisfaction for a moment before it was buried under the man's mask of interference again. So a test, then. Izuku hated him just a little for that. I'm done with this. Choose a different subject. Izuku huffed, looking away finally. Midoriya Izuku was nothing like Shoyuta expected. Sure, he was expecting to be met with a traumatized teenager. It wasn't anything outside of his normal scope of operations. Hell, he dealt with 20 traumatized kids on a daily basis. He hadn't thought that this was going to be any different. And he couldn't have proved himself more wrong if he'd tried, at this point. What kid had to beg someone not to tell their parents that they were alive? What kid tried to take their own life at such a young age? I'm done with this. Choose a different subject. Izuku had intoned, voice so blank and controlled that it almost broke Shuta's heart. How did an almost 16-year-old even know how to mask their emotions this well? Sighing, Shoyuta nodded and glanced back down at his list of questions. There were a lot more that he needed to mark out for the moment since this line of questioning was doing nothing more than losing him the trust he needed to build with the kid. How comfortable are you with hand-to-hand combat? I know you're good with your knives, which I have by the way and might give back depending on how you do this week. The kid blinked at him, surprised and more than a little confused if the way he'd uncurled from his ball just a little to peer at the hero over his knees was any indication. I am okay with hand-to-hand, I guess, but I've kinda built my skills more towards talking my way out of situations and analysis. He mumbled, fingers twisting at the fabric of his pants again, brows furrowed over his eyes. I guess the answer is I know enough to keep me alive? Shoyuta hummed, marking it down and tapping his pen against the paper as he thought. He'd have to train the kid himself if he wanted him to be able to take over that part of the lessons, then. It was doable at the very least. I'll need a sample of your analysis before I make any decisions on that, one way or the other, but I'm sure Nizu will cover that with you during his lessons. He nodded a little to himself before marking something else down on the paper. By this point he could feel the confusion practically rolling off of the teen across from him. Okay? What's this all about? Shoyuta lifted his gaze from where he was scribbling out the beginnings of a lesson plan and let his lips pull up into a grin. Did you think protecting the students from Shigaraki meant you were going to sit at the back of the classroom all day and do nothing? I need help getting these kids to the point where they can protect themselves, and you're going to help me. Shoyuta pointed the pen at the teen, holding back his laugh at the completely bewildered look on Izuku's face. In the meantime, we're not going to neglect your education either. So you'll be having private lessons with Nizu in the mornings while the hero course has their core classes. It was a testament to how smart the kid already was, though, that he didn't seem to flinch. Instead, one of his hands came up to cover his mouth as he started to mumble a little. The kid's grades in that first year of middle school had been nothing to sneeze at, but for him to have survived the way he had, there had to be some brain power behind those green eyes. Not many people could make a survivable way in the world on information trading alone, and from what he and Nizu were able to dig up, the kid had been doing pretty well for himself. Not that he should have had to learn that particular skill set in the first place, but Shoyuta was going to give credit where credit was due. All Might teaches heroics, though, doesn't he? Why would you have me teach things that he obviously can? The question snapped Shoyuta out of his thoughts, and he refocused, meeting the kid's gaze steadily. If his brow twitched a little in annoyance at the mention of the former number one here, then that was his business. Because honestly, his kids were far behind where they needed to be right now because of that idiot. You would be a sort of teaching assistant for him when he has other things to attend to. Which happened often and left his lesson plans thin and not up to Shuta's standards. Something he'd brought to Nizu over and over again. Something about the way Izuku's gaze sharpened told Shoyuta that he'd picked up on what he wasn't saying in this situation. There was also an ugly light behind the kid's eyes that didn't bode well, and Shoyuta couldn't for the life of him figure out what part of their current conversation was feeding it. You will also be helping me grade and other assorted other duties. He continued on, tearing his gaze away from the teen and glancing over his notes once more. There really wasn't anything else he could ask about at the moment, considering the metaphorical minefield he'd stepped into at the beginning of the conversation. He closed the notes he'd made and leaned back in his chair, taking note of the fact that Izuku had relaxed minutely now that they'd moved away from sensitive topics. This was going to be more complicated than anticipated, but that was fine. Now he just had to find a way to keep his gremlin class from purposely poking those minds with a stick. Rubbing a hand over his face, he let his eyes close for a moment as he went over everything in his head that needed to be done in the next few days. He just wanted to sleep and cuddle his husband. Neither of which was going to happen anytime soon. You're going to be staying here with me, your room is right down the hall. It's bare right now, but either me or someone else on staff will bring you to the mall to get decorations at some point. Izuku looked surprised at that, and Shoyuta had to stamp down the ugly feeling in his chest directed at every adult that had allowed this kid to get to this point. Nizu said something about the support department making you a phone, so you should have that by tomorrow or at the very latest before classes begin. I have to go start making the rounds to talk to students' parents about the dorm system. Shoyuta pushed himself to his feet, groaning a little as his joints protested, and grabbed the file off of the coffee table. He was going to have to submit all of this to Nizu before he left, so the principal would know how to structure the program. Feel free to hang out here if you want, but don't leave campus. I'll be back around 5 or so with dinner, so try and be back around then if you leave. He met the teen's gaze and only shuffled towards his room to get dressed properly when the kid nodded his understanding. Izuku still looked shell-shocked a little, but Shoyuta could handle that later. Right now, he had to figure out a way to convince All Might not to F up this whole talking to the parents situation. Watching the Bakugo family interact made Shoyuta suddenly very glad that he'd sent All Might on ahead to the next family. They were a little too much for him to be able to handle on top of the former number one. As it was, he was already planning in his head how much alcohol he could safely consume without being totally out of it for the first day of classes. There had to be a way to get out of his mind drunk, right? Bakugo Mitsuki ushered them all into the living room and sat down, forcing her son to sit between her and his father and expectantly looking at Shoyuta to start speaking. How did one family manage to have so much energy? And that was coming from the man married to present Mike. As you know, the school board has decided to change you into a boarding school for the safety of our students. He was cut off as the youngest Bakugo leaned forward and started speaking over him, bags under his eyes prominent and dark. Yeah, we know. They already signed the paper and everything. Where's Deku? You didn't leave him at that stupid police station, did you? He burst out, eyes ablaze before his mother reached over and pushed his head down with a noise of frustration. Katsuki! Stop interrupting! She barked, shaking the younger blonde's head. Aizawa paused for a moment, considering the action. It was unusual to see a parent so hands-on right in front of him, but Katsuki wasn't exploding, instead pushing up with his head as hard as he could and glaring at the woman. Wait, Deku? Do you mean Izuku, Katsuki? Bakugo's father's voice cut through whatever growling argument the mother and son were having. Mitsuki seemed to stare at her husband for a moment before shifting her hand to almost pet her son's hair instead of pushing on him. Katsuki? No, it was traumatic, kid, but you couldn't have seen him. The change from brash to soft almost gave Shoyuta whiplash. Instead of dwelling on whatever the hell was going on with these people, he decided to speak up since this was a topic he was very, very familiar with by now. Actually, if you're asking about Midoriya Izuku, he's alive and currently in the custody of UA. For his protection, he's been put into an old reform program through the school. Shoyuta met Katsuki's gaze and gave a brief nod. You'll be seeing a lot of him at UA, actually, as he's going to be assisting with some classes. Reform? Protection? What does that even mean? The kid has been gone for almost 3 years. Mitsuki seemed shell-shocked, absent-mindedly petting her son's hair as he slumped into her side. As this is an ongoing case, I can't give you a lot of details, ma'am. Shoyuta intoned, glad for the excuse to dodge some of the questions that he himself didn't have an answer to just yet. Or having to answer to this woman in general. Whatever he got into, it was serious. Katsuki mumbled from his spot against his mother's side, glancing between his parents uneasily as they both turned their gaze to him. He burst into the bar the league was holding me in and basically read Krusty the Ass Clown the riot act. I think he might have tried to bust me out if that guy All Might fought didn't make him go talk to him or some sheet. And wasn't that the most worrying part of all of this? What exactly did All for One want with a teenager? Let alone a teenager as smart and apparently tenacious as Izuku? Nothing good was the answer to that. Actually, if you have time right now, I do have some questions about Izuku. If you don't mind, it would help substantially. Izuku himself is a little tight-lipped about certain things. Shoyuta would probably regret this, but he did need the information. Of course. Anything to help Izuku. Masaru spoke up this time, leaning forward with a serious expression. The look was mimicked by the man's wife, red eyes boring into what felt like Shuta's soul. Thank you. How do you know Izuku? It was a baseline, anyway. He hadn't actually asked Izuku how he knew Bakugo yet. His mother and I are childhood friends. We raised the boys together as much as possible since we were so close together with our pregnancies. Mitsuki answered before pausing, eyes flying wide. Wait, have you told Inko yet? She's gonna cry for a week when she finds out. Please, don't tell her. I can't go back there. As of right now, she has not been informed. This is a delicate situation. Aizawa probably should have asked this question before confirming that the boy was alive, but what was done was done. He had to hope that this woman had the discretion to read between the DMN lines. Delicate? Her son has been dead for almost 3 years. Of course she needs to know. Or not. Movement at the woman's side drew Shuta's gaze, and he was met with the contemplative look of his student boring into him. One that was born from the lesson of logical ruses. Shoyuta was almost proud of the explosive teen. Hag, shut it. He doesn't do anything without a reason. The youngest Bakugo snapped, leaning forward and away from his mother, ignoring her indignant growl. What aren't you telling us? It has to be big if you're not following protocol and going through a minor's parents. Okay, Shoyuta was DMN proud of his students, but at this moment he wanted to throttle the kid. Because now 3 pairs of eyes were scrutinizing him, and why did everything surrounding Midoriya Izuku have to be so complicated? In his mind's eye he could see the desperate flash to Izuku's eyes when he begged not to have his mother informed of his status. So he went for the truth, mostly. I have reason to believe there is something in the home environment that contributed to his suicide attempt. He kept his tone serious and made sure to look all three of the Bakugos in the eye as he said it. Until the time comes that I can rule that out, he will not be returning to his mother's care. There was a beat of silence where the three people in front of him took that information in before all hell broke loose in the form of Bakugo Katsuki. The teenager jumped up from his seat, small explosions bouncing in his palms. Bullshit. Auntie had nothing to do with that. The blonde yelled, fighting against the hand his mother put on his arm to pull him back down onto the sofa. It's my fault, not hers. I'm the one that told him to jump. I'm the one that bullied him into even thinking that it was an option. For years. Ever since his stupid quirk didn't come in and mine did. Don't blame anyone else but me. I'm the one responsible. It took a moment for the teen's parents to corral him back onto the sofa with them, but even then the small explosions in his palms didn't die until Shoyuta flashed his quirk quickly. That seemed to get the teen's attention again and forced him to meet the hero's gaze once more. All Shoyuta could see in his eyes was self-loathing and anger. And if Shoyuta hadn't looked into Bakugo's records at the beginning of the year, he'd probably be more shocked by the outburst. If he hadn't seen the intense amount of therapy the kid had gone through before even stepping foot into the sheet show that was his first year at UE, he might have even believed the kid. Not that he didn't believe him about the bullying. He could easily see how a kid with a quirk as powerful as Bakugo Katsuki's could get the wrong idea in his head and turn into a holy terror. Especially when the kid he grew up with turned out to be quirkless. The nickname Deku now made a lot more sense to Shoyuta. And while he wasn't exactly happy about it, none of Izuku's recent actions spoke towards any held resentment against the youngest Bakugo. The only person he seemed to not want to know he was alive was his mother. And what did that say about the kid's home life that he'd rather the kid who bullied him and told him to jump know than his own mother? It stands to reason, Katsuki, that if you were the sole reason for his attempted suicide that he would have left you to rot in that bar, don't you think? Shoyuta kept his tone even, brow raised as the teen's gaze wavered a little. Yet, he walked into a bar full of enemies and attempted to do what he could for you. Now, while it ended up just making the plan that your foolish classmates carried out, he still cared enough to try. That doesn't sound like someone who thinks you're the sole reason for his attempt. That's because the nerd has been too nice for his own good his whole life. Katsuki muttered as he sank back into his mother's side, brows furrowed and arms crossed over his chest. His mother looked between the two, her face filled with uncertainty. This was obviously not the first time this subject had come up in the years since. She turned back to Shoyuta, though, with a determination in her eyes that he was familiar with when it came to her son. But why suspect Inko? Sure, she had to work a lot since her husband moved overseas, but that boy was her entire world. Shoyuta could almost see the protective urges rising in the woman and sighed to himself. He just wanted to sleep at this point. Sleep and only have to deal with his own personal loud blonde. Because when I mentioned having a discussion with her, the kid freaked out. He said after a moment, giving in to the urge to rub his hand over his face. I don't know exactly what led to that series of events that day, but it's not exactly a good sign when a child begs someone not to tell their parent they survived. He could see the confusion wearing on the Bakugo's faces and promptly decided he was done with this situation. The hero pushed himself to stand and bowed to them slightly. The school will be in touch about move-in day and the proper supplies to bring. He turned to exit the room when Katsuki jumped to his feet once more. Wait, can I talk to Izuku? Shoyuta rubbed his hand over his eyes for a moment before turning back and sighing. There will be a proper introduction to him once everyone is settled in the dorms. At that point, he can decide for himself if he wants to have that conversation with you, Bakugo. The teen deflated a little at that but nodded, red eyes stormy as he shoved his hands into his pockets. Shoyuta nodded to the teen's parents and turned around and left. They probably needed to have a very long talk amongst themselves, and he didn't have the energy to even witness it. After dealing with parents and the Bakugo situation, Shoyuta fully believed he deserved to sleep for the next week. Obviously there was no way that was going to happen, but by the gods he could hope. Entering the new apartment, a bag of takeout for the three of them in his hand, he paused to kick off his boots. And then paused again when he took in the quiet atmosphere of the house. It took him a moment to latch onto the noise of his husband humming from somewhere in the house, and once he did, he relaxed a little. Rarely was their home this quiet. It was going to take a hot minute to get used to living on campus, but at the very least, with 2 of his husband's 3 jobs close by, he'd get to see him more than he already did. Plus, with a teenager in the mix, things were definitely going to get shaken up a bit. Shoyuta headed into the living room only to pause again, brow quirked at the massive bundle of blankets on the sofa. Izuku's face peered out from them after a moment, a glare set on the teen's face. "You didn't tell me you live with present Mike." The teen hissed, blanket bundle wiggling a little as he tried to get a hand free to point accusingly at the underground hero. Shoyuta couldn't help the laugh that escaped him as he kept walking, only pausing to stick his hand in the kid's hair and ruffle it a little. "Kid, I'm married to present Mike," he said, ignoring the squawk of surprise that the kid let out as he walked past. For a moment he wondered if it was the head touch or his words, but ultimately decided he didn't care. "You're married?" There was shuffling behind him of the blankets, and a second later the kid came skidding into the kitchen with a feral look on his face. Shoyuta just blinked at him before turning his attention back to unpacking the bag of takeout. He could hear Hizashi laughing somewhere deeper in the apartment and guessed the blonde was giving them some space. Gods, he loved that man. "Yes, kid, we are married. Have been for many, many years." Glancing up, he took note of the weird look on the kid's face. He almost looked dazed for some reason. Shoyuta didn't say anything else, moving around the kitchen to grab plates and utensils as he set the table. A minute or so passed before Hizashi joined them, dropping a kiss on Shuta's cheek as he passed to open the fridge. It took a minute or more for the kid to gather his thoughts, still hovering nervously near the entrance of the kitchen. His eyes followed their every move, brows furrowed a little as if still confused. You do realize that this kind of information would make me rich, right? That I sell information for a living." The kid's voice was quiet, confusion laced in every word. His eyes were stormy and uncertain as he met Shuta's gaze. "Not anymore, you don't. Besides, we would know where it came from. You're the only one aside from the rest of the staff here that knows." Shoyuta said it carefully, shrugging a shoulder like he didn't care about the outcome of what he was talking about. He could see Hizashi out of the corner of his eye watching the interaction carefully. Could almost visibly see his husband catch on to what he was doing. Of course he didn't take this lightly. Of course it was a big deal that the kid knew something they'd kept successfully under wraps for years. Though now that he thought about it, the Hell class was going to figure it out as well soon. He'd deal with that when it came time. "I know that, but..." Izuku floundered for a moment, trying to find the right words as his gaze flickered between the 2 heroes quickly. "That's a lot of trust you're putting in me, Eraserhead." The kid looked so lost and confused in that moment that Shoyuta took pity on him. He motioned for him to sit down across from him as Hizashi took a seat on the other side of the table as well. His husband was going to tease him mercilessly later about adoption, but it wasn't like he could look this kid in the eyes and just leave him to his own devices. That's how he'd gotten tangled up in the mess he was already in. Call Shoyuta protective. This was a teenager who needed someone to take care of them. And if Shoyuta was in a position to provide that support, then he was going to give it, in any way he could. "Aizawa. Or Shoyuta, if you prefer," he corrected gently, handing a container of food to the teen. "And yes, it is, isn't it? It also gives you a safety net, right? Think of it like that. A safety net that he wouldn't ever have to use if Shoyuta had anything to say about it." But nevertheless, he wanted the kid to relax, and if giving him some sort of knowledge to hold over them if he felt he needed some control, then so be it. Shoyuta watched as Hizashi knocked his shoulder gently against the teen's to get his attention, smiling brightly when he turned his attention towards him. "Call me Hizashi, little listener. And Shuta's right, we don't think you'll do anything with the info, but if it makes you feel a little more in control, then we're happy to offer it up." Izuku nodded, still looking lost as he turned his gaze back down to his food. Shoyuta decided to leave it for the moment, let the kid process before they dumped any more information on him. At some point they'd have to discuss the conversation Shoyuta and the Bakugo family had, of course, but he was willing to let it go for the moment. There were other, lighter, things to take care of. Classes start the day after tomorrow. Shoyuta changed the subject easily, digging into his own food. We'll take you to get some clothes and stuff for your room tomorrow before the students start arriving. Hizashi, the extrovert that he was, perked up at that and shot him a blinding smile. Oh, that'll be so much fun. Shoyuta almost wanted to laugh at the look of betrayal Izuku sent him. Almost. Because he was really punishing himself with this as well. The first day of classes came faster than Izuku was comfortable with, honestly. The day before they'd managed to get back to the dorms before the students arrived, and Izuku spent the rest of the day setting up his room with Hizashi. He was allowed to call Present Mike by his name. He now knew Eraserhead's full name, and had been reminded several times over the past 2 days to call him Shoyuta or Aizawa. It was a little surreal, honestly. Last night had been rather quiet, just Hizashi and Izuku setting up furniture and the hero helping Izuku put some posters the two adults had urged him to buy on the walls. Something had settled in Izuku's chest, looking around the room. It was honestly the first time in years that he'd had a space of his own. Safe houses didn't count. He wasn't sure, at this point, that his room in his mother's home counted either. Somehow this room, as hastily thrown together as it was, felt safer and more his than anything he'd had before. It wasn't a feeling he wanted to examine at the moment, so he set it aside. He'd deal with his baggage at a later date. He had other things to focus on, like that he was currently standing outside of the 1A classroom waiting for Aizawa to announce him. They hadn't really talked about how this introduction would go, but there was a lead weight in Izuku's stomach at the thought of standing in front of 20 hero students and listening to Aizawa tell them his history and why he was here. Even if Aizawa wouldn't let them get out of hand, let them do what his middle school classmates had done, he couldn't get the thought out of his head. Then there was the issue of Kaken. Aizawa had told him about the conversation he'd had with Kaken and his parents, and while Izuku wasn't upset that the Bakugos knew he was alive, the nagging thought that this would get back to his mother had kept him awake longer than he would have liked. Plus, having to face Kaken today was going to be difficult enough as it was. He didn't think he was ready for the whole conversation that they needed to have. But he didn't think the other boy was going to take no for an answer, considering the way they'd left things at the police station. Izuku was pulled out of his thoughts by the rumbling of Aizawa's voice inside the classroom. Each assistant joining for heroics and other subjects as needed this year. Be respectful or else, gremlins. The teenager pulled himself off of the wall and slid the door of the classroom open, stepping inside and stopping next to the podium Aizawa was standing behind. The weight of 20 stares settled on his shoulders, and he couldn't help the way his hands slid into the sleeves of his hoodie. He and Hizashi had compromised on his outfit for today. He could keep the hoodie as long as he wore the black slacks and white dress shirt that the blonde had picked out for him. He decided to keep it unzipped for the moment, letting it hang down past his hips more than it usually did. The one thing he'd willingly given up was his shoes. The red was a little obnoxious, and not great for blending into the background like he so wished to do right this moment, but also anyone who was in the know would know with one glance that he was quirkless. And if he could manage to keep that information to himself for as long as possible, he would be thrilled. Aizawa had left the conversation about clothes entirely at the beginning, declaring he didn't care if Izuku wore sweatpants and a crop top. Hizashi had been rather indigent about it. He stood at the podium, his eyes quickly gravitated to the students who had shown up at the warehouse that night. Each of them looked a little shell-shocked, eyes blown wide and mouths gaping open. The blue-haired boy looked about ready to have a heart attack. Which made sense because he'd been close enough to hear the officers when Izuku had been arrested that morning. He'd had some hope that the whole villain thing would be easy to avoid for a while. Well, he'd figure it out. Just like he was decidedly avoiding the intense eye contact Kaken was trying to have with him right now. Out of all of the other students, the blonde's gaze felt the heaviest on him. Almost burned with its intensity. Gods, he was not ready for this. Mr. Aizawa. Surely you must know that this is a villain you are allowing into U's halls. The blue-haired boy had risen to his feet, arm making a chopping motion in his panic. Izuku's heart sank at the words and he wanted to curl in on himself. He curbed the instinct just barely and instead focused on the issue at hand. Aizawa had given him permission to deal with the class as he saw fit when it came to training. Knowledge was the most powerful tool, wasn't it? Pen mightier than the sword and all that? So instead of curling in on himself, Izuku squared his shoulders and met the other teen's gaze head-on. He could see the rest of the class shifting uncertainly, tense and starting to mutter and mumble among themselves. That is information you only know because you participated in an illegal rescue attempt when Bakugo Katsuki was kidnapped. Izuku said calmly, clasping his hands behind him and pulling himself up to his full height. It wasn't much, but it was sure to show he meant business, at least. I don't think you have a leg to stand on, Ida Tenya, when it comes to villainous activity. No, not when the boy had the gall to think he as a student could take out a villain that had killed numerous trained professionals. He'd have to make sure the other boy knew that he knew that little fact at his earliest convenience. A side glance to Aizawa told him that the man was giving him the floor, and he fought the urge to sigh. Thrown to the wolves on the first day? Efficient, yes, but still. He would be sure to be as dramatic as possible when retelling this story to Hisashi later. My name is Midoriya Izuku, please just call me Izuku. As your classmates so tactfully blurted out, I was considered a villain at one point in time. Now, I'm a ward of you at A and here to help you not get killed by Shigaraki Tamura. He could tell he had their attention, eyes scanning the rows of students carefully. He made eye contact with each student for a moment before shifting a little to reach for the collar of his shirt. It was Ida's gaze he went back to and held as his fingers worked at the top button of his dress shirt. I happen to know a little about what it means to be targeted by him. He let his words sink in as he pushed his shirt open to reveal the handprint scar against his collarbone and wrapping over his shoulder. A few of the students' mouths hung open and one girl with a darker shade of green hair than his own turned her eyes away quickly, a hand coming up to cover her mouth. His point made, he closed his shirt once more and turned his gaze over to Aizawa. The man's jaw flexed as he met Izuku's gaze, but he could tell that the man wasn't upset with him. He was upset for him. Which was stupid considering he'd picked the fight that had caused this particular scar. It was his own stupidity that had done it. And it wasn't something the hero would be able to fix. Aizawa tore his gaze away from Izuku to glare out at his class once more, quirk activated as their whispers started to raise in volume. Ida, we will be having a discussion about the proper time and place to divulge information later on. Please pay attention. The teen in question nodded choppily and sank back into his seat, properly chastised. The hero turned his attention back to the rest of the class. Today's heroics lesson is going to be on basic hand-to-hand techniques. Go change into your gym clothes and meet back here. Izuku relaxed a little as the students started getting up and milling towards the door. He allowed himself to take a few steps back and partially hide himself behind Aizawa. The man seemed to know what he was doing and let him, still standing at the podium as the class filed out instead of slinking into his sleeping bag. Izuku shot him a grateful look that was answered with a small quirk of the man's lips. All in all, the first introduction hadn't gone too horribly. Nothing was on fire, at least. Yet, his mind whispered as he caught sight of Kaken dragging his feet in collecting his things. Of course he couldn't get out of some sort of conversion with the explosive teen. He shot Aizawa a just slightly panic-filled look, but the man seemed to purposely not be looking at him, eyes trained on a folder in front of him. Demen him. Another thing to dramatically complain to Hisashi about. Sighing and running a hand through his hair, Izuku stepped out from behind Aizawa as the last student besides Kaken filtered out of the classroom. The last student, the redhead with the hardening quirk from the rescue mission, shot a lingering look behind him as he left but said nothing about the fact that Kaken was dragging his feet. Smart kid, that one. Kaken. Izuku said the name simply as he stood in front of his once childhood friend, fingers twisting anxiously in the sleeves of his hoodie. The blonde's gaze bore into him and for a moment he wanted to run away. Have this conversation on a day where he could be positive it wouldn't end in tears. The blonde stared at him for a moment longer before bowing, posture so stiff and tight that Izuku could have cut himself on it if he had reached out at that moment. If he'd had the mind to do anything but gape at the teen in front of. I'm sorry. The blonde teen's voice was muffled a little, but the tone was clear. Regret. Self-loathing. Anger, possibly directed at himself? Izuku didn't know much past that, his entire brain shorting out at the absurdity of this whole situation. I know that words don't mean jack shit and won't fix anything, but I am sorry. Sorry that you had to deal with all of my bullshit. Sorry that I pushed you to think that jumping off of that bridge was a good idea. Sorry that I made you think you were better off where you were than at home. I'm so goddamn sorry about all of it. Izuku cut his gaze toward Aizawa, whose own eyes were wide at the display. When he met Izuku's gaze, he gave a small shrug and the teen wanted to throw something at him. Hearing Kaken cry was decidedly not something Izuku was built to handle. And that was exactly in front of him, right now. He couldn't see Kaken's face, but his voice was thick with tears and regret. Unable to stand the feeling swirling in his gut, Izuku closed what little distance was between him and the other boy and reached out to lay a hand on his shoulder. Katsuki's head lifted at the touch and met Izuku's own watery gaze. Seemingly panicked that he'd made the green-haired teen cry, Katsuki stood up and grasped at the teen's wrist, eyes blown wide with panic. Kaken, no. None of this was your fault. The unbelieving look on the other's face made him backtrack a little, free hand waving and gesturing quickly. Okay, some of it was you, but not all. Not even the majority. Me not coming home had nothing to do with you. I promise. There was no way he could tell Katsuki who actually caused all of this. Not yet, at least. He wasn't petty enough to break someone's faith in their hero while there were more important things to worry about. A look came across Katsuki's face before his eyes darted towards Aizawa and back to Izuku, brows furrowed. Was it Auntie? Did she hurt you somehow? Izuku almost smiled at the almost protective tone in the other's voice. He hadn't heard it in so long. No, Kaken. She didn't hurt me. Not physically, at least. It's not complicated. He could see from the furrow in the other teen's brow that he wasn't going to let this go, so Izuku changed tactics. He shifted the arm that Katsuki was holding until he was clasping at Izuku's hand. He could almost feel Aizawa's eyes boring into him and brushed it off. It wasn't like he was holding hands with someone in front of his dad. Nope, not at all. He hadn't known the man long enough for that. Not even a little. You have class to get to, Kaken, and this isn't a conversation we can have quickly, you know? He kept his tone soft as he met the stormy red gaze with his own. I forgive you, Kaken. Yeah, words don't mean shit, but actions do. Show me you're sorry and give me a little space for right now, and maybe we can work on starting over. Katsuki seemed torn, but at the gentle squeeze of his hand finally nodded, free hand coming up to rub at his face angrily. Izuku almost felt bad that the rest of the class was probably going to be able to tell he'd been crying. Almost. The explosive teen squeezed his hand before letting it go entirely and picking up his bag, silently meeting Aizawa's gaze before making his way out of the classroom. Once he was gone, Izuku let himself curl in on himself a little, hands rubbing over his face tiredly. Nothing ever went his way, did it? At least this surprise could turn out to be a good thing, this time. He hoped. Gods, did he hope? So, Kaken, huh? Izuku lifted his face to glare at the other man. Hush before I tell the class that you have to have a good night kiss from Hisashi before you have for patrol. Don't you dare, problem child. The transition into the dorms went smoothly and the students and teachers alike fell into an easy routine. Most nights, Shoyuta would find himself settling down at one of the tables in the common room to grade or go over reports for a few hours. Was this absolutely necessary? Not really. It did, however, make him feel better. Most of these kids were old enough to be self-sufficient, but it didn't hurt to be extra cautious. Especially after the first fire, Kirishima started in the kitchen attempting to cook. It was easier to be in the area or tucked into a nearby corner to keep an eye on his Hell class than it was to have to be summoned from his apartment. Plus, it wasn't like there was anyone there but the cats until a certain time. Hisashi always worked for a few hours after classes ended at the station, and Izuku had started working on socializing with kids his own age. Shoyuta had no comment on how well that was going, currently. Poorly. It was going poorly. The kid had little to no normal social skills. Shoyuta lifted his gaze from the papers in his lap to scan the common room again, brow scrunching a little when he realized he hadn't seen his ward since classes had let out that afternoon. Slightly worrying. It was a tiny break in routine that nagged at the back of the hero's mind. Usually Izuku sat with him for a little while going over lesson plans and whatever homework Nizu had given him before wandering off to attempt to act like a normal teenager. After making little progress, he'd come back to the apartment to hang out with Shoyuta and Hizashi before Shoyuta left for patrol. His gaze flickered through the students currently in the common room, pen tapping against the papers in his lap idly as he thought. Uraraka, Azui, and Jairu were huddled around one table trying to make heads or tails of the homework Hizashi had assigned. Beyond them, he could see Bakugo attempting to literally beat the knowledge on their next test into Kaminari and Kirishima's heads with a rolled-up paper while Shiro laughed at them. He could hear Ida, somewhere out of his vision, scolding Bakugo and his group for being loud. He was trying to recall where the rest of the class was when the elevator dinged behind him. In itself, it wouldn't be something to pay attention to if he couldn't hear the yelling coming from inside of it. The door slid open and the yelling became words instead of indistinct noise. "Of me, you stupid villain." It was Mineta's voice, and Shoyuta took a moment to close his eyes and steady his temper before he turned around. Izuku was holding the student by the back of his shirt off of the ground, and the look on his face was nothing less than furious. Shuta's eyes slid away from the two boys to the two other students coming out of the elevator. Ashido and Yaoyorozu walked behind Izuku as he made his way further into the common area. Both girls looked uncomfortable and pale. Ashido's hand rested on Yaoyorozu's back comfortingly as they made their way forward. "How dare you touch me? Let me down this instant. I'm going to get you thrown in jail so fast for assaulting a student." Mineta continued to yell as he wiggled uselessly in Izuku's grip. At this point, everyone in the commons area watched as the green-haired teen stalked toward Shoyuta, knuckles white with how hard he was holding onto the perverted teenager in his grip. The teen stopped in front of the hero and shook the grape-haired boy in his grip in his direction. "I found this little pervert in Yaoyorozu's room, going through her underwear drawer." Izuku growled, shaking the smaller teen again when he made a noise to protest. Shoyuta blinked and took a moment to count to 10 in his mind. Had he not just impressed upon these kids just a week ago to not step a single toe out of line? Was he not clear in the threat? With All Might's retirement, it was going to be much more difficult to expel students, but he was sure Nizu was going to make an exception here. Especially in this case. What were you even doing up there? Shouldn't Mr. Aizawa be more worried about a villain roaming around the campus? Mineta spat, wiggling around again to glare up at the green-haired teen. Izuku growled and dropped the smaller teen to the ground, looming over him with a look that would have sent most sane people running for the hills. Mineta apparently didn't have the sense the gods gave a fly, though, because he just kept ranting about being manhandled and assaulted. Shoyuta wondered where exactly he'd gone wrong recently to deserve this kind of headache. "Izuku, why were you on the 5th floor in the first place?" he asked, pinching the bridge of his nose before glancing at his ward. "I heard this disgusting little creep muttering about panties and cameras earlier and asked the girls if they'd be comfortable with me checking their rooms just in case." The green-haired teen growled the words out, hands flexing at his sides as he glared down at Mineta. "Yaoyorozu and Ashido came with me to be witnesses that I wasn't doing anything sketchy." By now a crowd had gathered around, and when Shoyuta glanced towards Uraraka and the other girls, they just nodded to agree with Izuku's statement. Azui and Jur looked angry about it as well, so he turned his gaze over to the two girls that came out of the elevator with the other two. "We found him in my room, and it looks like he might have been in Ashido's room just before mine." Yaoyorozu's voice was steady for the most part, but Shoyuta could just barely hear the tremor in it. His gaze flickered between the girls of his class and back to Mineta, who was growing increasingly pale. "Were there any cameras?" he asked, gaze flicking back to Izuku. The teen's jaw was clenched, but he was calming down slowly, hands no longer flexing and no longer looking like he was about to stomp the smaller teen at any moment. "None that I could find." With a sigh, Shoyuta gathered the loose papers in his lap together and slid them back into order before standing. He handed the folder to Izuku before his capture weapon snapped forward to wrap Mineta up. The purple-haired teen made an indignant noise before his mouth was covered as well. Shoyuta held him up to eye level, glaring at him with as much wrath as he could muster without activating his quirk. "We're going to have a nice long discussion about this with Principal Nizu. I do remember not even a week ago warning you what would happen if you put a toe out of line. He flicked his gaze back around the room to the students watching and fought the urge to sigh again. Back to what you were doing. Don't burn the building down while I'm gone. Izuku watched Shoyuta leave the building and let out the deepest sigh he could muster, shoulders sagging as the unadulterated rage he'd felt finding that little creep in the girl's room finally seeped out of him. He'd run into way too many disgusting people like that kid to let it stand. It was his job to protect these kids from villains, and in his opinion that little fucker was about a step away from being the worst kind of villain. Running a hand through his hair, he turned to face the students who had gathered to watch the entire scene go down with a little bit of trepidation. Sure, he knew that the girls were going to be grateful, but the others were a wild card right now. Especially since the little pervert had thrown around the word villain like he had. The first gaze he caught was Kaken's, the red eyes taking on a thoughtful light to them before flickering toward Ishido and then back to him. The blonde teen gave him a little nod before reaching out to drag Kaminari and Kirishima back towards the table they'd been studying at. As soon as Kaken did so, the rest of the teens seemed to snap out of their stupor and all moved at once towards Izuku. He fought not to flinch as they crowded around him. Now, that was so cool, man. I kinda wish I'd gotten it on video. Shiro laughed, patting Izuku on the shoulder and flashing him a grin as he passed him on his way back towards Kaken's group. Izuku managed a small smile and a nod before turning his attention back to the girls that were crowded around him. I can check again for cameras, if that would make you comfortable. I don't think he placed any from what I can see. More than likely the grape was planning on trying to place them and just hadn't had the chance yet. Yaoyorozu smiled at him and waved her hand in dismissal, tension uncoiling from her shoulders now that the threat was taken care of. No, it's fine. We wouldn't want to trouble you any further. Izuku frowned a little, a hand coming up to scratch at the back of his neck as he glanced around the circle of girls in front of him. I mean, it's not any trouble. It's kinda my job, you know? I'd be doing a pretty bad job of protecting you guys if I let a creep like that keep making y'all feel unsafe. He said it with a little shrug, eyes flickering from girl to girl in an effort to make eye contact with all of them. He needed them to understand him on this. He didn't have the built-in trust that Aizawa did with the students, but he needed them to at least trust he'd do his best. Ishido let out a coo and reached forward to pinch his cheeks, and he reined in the instinct to slap her hands away, instead just leaning away from her as far as he could get without falling over. It didn't do much good as she just followed, a grin on her face. I call dibs for the Baku squad, she declared, grinning triumphantly and ignoring the indigent yell from Uraraka. Hey, no fair. I call dibs. The cutie is ours. While the two girls good-naturedly bickered, Izuku found himself being dragged towards Kaken's group, Ishido's hands now wrapped around his arm. Oi, round face, unless you're here to study, shut it. I don't want to listen to these two whine if they fail again. Kaken grunted as Izuku was pushed down into a chair at their table, Ishido sitting next to him and Uraraka hovering a little to the side. The brown-haired girl stuck her tongue out at the explosive blonde and slid into the seat next to Ishido. She flopped her arms down on the table and made a face at Kaken when he growled at her. I'm just saying, blasty. You can't exclusively call dibs on him. Let the rest of us have a shot. Izuku ducked his head to hide his grin at the bored look Kaken was sending the girl, enjoying the energy of the table. He'd been worried for a hot moment that Kaken and the gravity-quirked girl wouldn't get along based on what he'd seen of the sports festival, but the more he observed them, both in class and outside, it seemed they weren't actively antagonistic towards each other. Hell, some of their actions and words were almost teasing. It was interesting to watch and compare to his mental image of Kaken from middle school. It was amazing to see how much the blonde had grown in such a short amount of time. He immediately wanted to take that thought back, though, when the blonde glanced over and met Izuku's eye. The smirk that quirked his lips upward only spelled trouble. Considering I've known the nerd since we were in diapers, I'm sure he would have ended up over here anyway. Smugly, turning back to Uraraka. Kaken! Izuku squawked, sitting up and reaching over to smack the other teen on the arm. Ever heard of need-to-know information? Like you were going to be able to hide that, nerd. You can't even call me by the right name. The blonde shot back, smirk now stretched into a full-blown grin. Kaken. That's great. I'm going to call you that exclusively now. Kaminari thumped the table with his hand, grinning as he leaned into Kaken's space. The explosive teen growled at him and smacked him with the rolled-up paper again. You don't get to call me sheet when you can't even pass one single test, dipshit. Kaken growled, smacking him a few more times when Kaminari's only reaction was to laugh at him. Izuku watched the interaction with a small, fond smile on his face and only tore his eyes away when Ishido nudged him with her shoulder, a slow grin curling at her lips. Kaken, huh? Her tone was low enough that only Izuku could hear it and teasing enough that it brought a bright blush to his cheeks. Like he said, we've known each other since we were little. I don't think I've ever called him anything else. He hissed back, bringing up his hands to cover his face. Raccoon eyes. What did you say to him? Stop trying to embarrass the nerd, he might catch himself on fire or something stupid like that. Everything had been going well, Izuku thought. He'd finally found an in to bond with the class. Mina and Uraraka were never far away from him now in the dorms, and the others seemed to accept him as well, including him in activities and asking for study tips. Ida was still distant and a little distrustful of him, but he could deal with that. Kaken was very sweet in keeping some of the more intrusive of his classmates off of his back when it came to the reason he was ward of the school in the first place. Eventually Izuku knew he was going to have to come clean about everything, quirklessness included, but for now he was enjoying feeling almost normal for the first time in his life. Everything was easy, almost. Izuku's lessons with Nizu were more fun than anticipated and quite honestly felt like a setup for world domination with the way the principal had him analyzing situations around the school. It was great practice and great fun. He was even enjoying the hacking lessons the rat was giving him. All in all, they weren't traditional lessons, but he couldn't help but feel Nizu had a plan regardless. It was nice, honestly, to let someone else handle the planning. Things with Shoyuta and Hizashi were amazing as well. Their routine was easy to fall into at this point. Izuku would help Shoyuta with grading and lesson plans or even just case notes after classes ended before the other students wandered down to the common areas to start prepping dinner or separate study sessions. Shoyuta would ruffle his hair a little, sometimes, before he got up to head back to the apartment and leave Izuku to whatever the class decided to do that evening. Izuku would hang out with the class for a little while before excusing himself when he saw Hizashi sneaking into the building, making a beeline for the apartment right after the blonde hero. Hizashi and Shoyuta made it a point to have dinner together nightly, before Shoyuta had to go on patrol, and Izuku made a point to be back in the apartment in time for dinner every night. It was domestic and nice, honestly. Talking over dinner with the two older men about one as shenanigans or the different ways Shoyuta had tried to sneak off that day to nap. If Izuku was being 100% honest, it was the best part of his day. It made him feel warm and happy in a way he couldn't remember ever being in his life. Inko wasn't cold to him, per se, but as he got older dinner together happened less and less often. Before everything, he just chalked it up to her having to work so hard to support them, but now? How could he? Hizashi worked 3 jobs and Shoyuta worked 2, but both men purposely made the time to spend a meal together. So why couldn't his mother care enough to do the same? He did his best not to dwell on these kinds of thoughts, focusing more on learning how to make lesson plans and putting small bits of input in on when and how to teach things they were planning. If he wanted to stay in the bubble of warmth he'd found himself in, he'd have to make himself useful. Not that he thought they'd kick him back out on the streets or into jail if he didn't, but at this point, what else could he do to repay either Shoyuta or Nizu for what they'd given him? Of course, he should have known things were going far too well for far too long. He was reminded of his shitty luck when he walked into the 1A classroom 2 weeks after arriving at the school and saw a familiar figure standing at the front of the classroom. All Might. The man was in his shrunken form, having been revealed in the Battle of Kamino, talking with a few students. Izuku fought to swallow down the lump in his throat that threatened to choke him. If he had to describe it, he would say it felt like ice had been injected into his veins. Sure, he knew he'd have to face the man eventually, but he'd hoped he would get a little bit of notice beforehand. Izuku could feel eyes on him, and he tore his gaze away from the former number 1 hero to meet Katsuki's eyes, burning curiosity meeting abject panic. Just from that one glance he could tell that Katsuki didn't understand his reaction from the way his brows furrowed and his gaze bounced between the ex-villain and the symbol of peace. As if sensing the tension, the retired teacher glanced up from the conversation he was having with the crowd around him. His gaze felt like the weight of 10 elephants settling on Izuku's shoulders, and his couldn't help but hold his breath and wait for the recognition to settle into the man's expression. Recognition was not what settled on the man's face, however. It was so much worse. Barely. Disguised distaste. No one else except maybe Katsuki caught the look, the class distracted by the hero inadvertently calling attention to Izuku's arrival. The group dispersed from around All Might, heading towards their desks and laughing amongst themselves. He'd been working with Shoyuta so much in the past 2 weeks on lessons that his arrival to the room was almost as powerful as Shoyuta himself walking in the room to get the class to settle. If he wasn't so freaked out at the moment, he'd be a little proud. Knees wobbling a little bit, Izuku finally moved further into the room and behind the podium. He set his bag down at the base and glanced hopefully towards the desk, hoping to see a familiar yellow sleeping bag tucked underneath. But today was a bad luck day. Of course. No Shoyuta to help him. Shoyuta didn't even know he needed an out from this, either. Not for the last time had his need to keep info close to his chest had backfired on him spectacularly. Katsuki watched All Might as he moved to stand in the front of the room, his smile the same as ever as he faced the class. But Katsuki had seen the look he'd given Izuku. He'd also seen the look of absolute panic on the teen's face when he'd walked in to see the former symbol of peace standing there. And it wasn't the panic Katsuki was expecting either. This wasn't the fanboy, "my hero is here," reaction he'd been looking forward to. No, this was almost abject horror. For a moment, he let his gaze wander back towards the green-haired teen and felt the confusion grow tenfold. Green eyes were glued to the podium, knuckles white as he gripped the sides of it to keep himself in place. Everything about his posture screamed that he wanted to be anywhere else but in this room. A little differently today. I thought for my first day back we could have a class discussion. Katsuki tuned back in quickly, tearing his eyes away from Izuku and back to All Might as the man grinned at the class. Today's discussion is going to be around villains and why we must never let our guard down when it comes to apprehending them and bringing them to justice. A month ago, a lecture on this topic would have drawn a little groan from the class, but they would have moved on. Now the entire class shifted almost as one uneasily. Almost every eye slid away from the hero and towards Izuku at the podium. The teen's expression was blank, but from his spot in the front Katsuki could see the way his hands shook as he shoved them in his pockets. All Might, seemingly not feeling the shift in the energy of the room, continued speaking as if he wasn't intentionally targeting the teen behind him with his words and choice in topic. The first thing you need to remember is that villains will say whatever they feel will get them out of trouble, or something that will have you lowering your guard enough for them to attempt to strike you down. Even in his deflated form, his voice was booming and commanding. All eyes were on the man again, but even Katsuki could feel the uneasy rippling through the room. Please remember that you can't trust anything a villain says to you for this reason. All they care about is destruction and chaos at the end of the day. He could see his classmates shifting their focus every few seconds from what the man was saying to what Izuku's reaction would be. It had only been a week or so of actually befriending the teen, but the class was already fairly fond of him. Katsuki turned his head a little to try and catch a glance of raccoon eyes. Her face was twisted into a scowl and her hands were fisted against the top of her desk. If he had to hazard a guess, Round Face was probably doing something very similar, but he couldn't turn to check without drawing more attention to himself. Not to correct you, All Might, but that isn't entirely true. Izuku's voice held a small tremor, but the steel that had entered his posture. His hands still shook a little as All Might turned to face him. Young Midoriya, you are not welcome to participate. I'm sure everyone would prefer it if you return to your quarters at once. This class is no place for you. Katsuki was halfway out of his seat when Izuku's eyes cut his way, a warning clear enough in his gaze. The blonde wordlessly growled, hands flexing as he sank back into his seat. Rage, hot and burning, surged through his chest and he had to fight the urge to just explode the thing causing it. Especially when the man turned his back to Izuku once more, a clear dismissal, and smiled back out at the class. My name is Izuku, please, and I have the authorization from both Principal Nizu and Aizawa to be here. This is as much my class as it is yours. The teen's voice brokered no argument as he stepped out from behind the podium and forced himself into the pro-hero's line of sight once more. And you are currently not setting realistic expectations for them in the slightest. The teen angled his body so he was facing the class without turning his back on the hero, a smart move considering the thunderous look on the man's face. Not every villain you're going to face is going to be a megalomaniac hell-bent on ruling or destroying the world. Especially not as fresh graduates. The teen's hand came up in a shushing motion when All Might opened his mouth to speak again. Katsuki could almost see the steam pouring out of the man's ears to match the red color that was taking over his neck and face. The most common type of villain you're going to encounter is going to be one committing petty theft. Or a purse snatching. Especially for those of you who are going into limelight heroics. These villains are just going to be people trying to survive. As interesting as the points being made were, none of the class could focus on that. Instead, every eye in the room was on All Might and the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides and the uncharacteristic scowl on his face. Katsuki wasn't the only one who could see the tension in Izuku. It practically rolled off of him in waves, and he was vividly reminded of that night in the bar. The teen's fingers were hidden in his sleeves once more, but he could almost picture him brandishing a knife at the man in his mind's eye. A part of him wondered if he should be worried about how not worried that image made him. A part of him almost wished Izuku had his weapons to defend himself with right now. Young Midoriya dash. Izuku. Leave this instant. You have no business around the students or pretending to be an equal or above them. Nizu has clearly lost his mind letting someone as dangerous as you roam the school as he pleases, but I will not stand for it. Steam poured off of the man as he barely restrained himself from welling up into his muscled form. Dangerous? Please. Mina spoke up then, standing up from her desk and slamming her hands down to get the man's attention. Izuku has done nothing but help since he got here. He listened to us when Mineta was giving us problems and actually did something. There was a murmur of agreement from the girls in the class, and somehow that seemed to anger the symbol of peace even further. Katsuki rose from his seat as well, tension building in his arms as he flexed his hands and let off little pops with his quirk. His eyes were glued to Izuku, though, and the way his eyes darted around the classroom. Miss Ishido, young Bakugo, sit back down. Obviously he has pulled the wool over your eyes, which proves the need for this lesson. He is an admitted associate of All for One and cannot be trusted. Distantly, Katsuki registered the way Izuku jerked like he'd been slapped and took an instinctive step away from All Might. Something in him snapped and Katsuki stepped forward and grabbed the other teen by the elbow and pulled him until he was behind him. Standing between All Might and Izuku, Katsuki bared his teeth at the retired hero. Are you going to accuse me of the same thing just because I was in that bar that night, too? Huh? He snarled out, hand not pushing Izuku behind him, popping dangerously with sparks. That is enough. This is unbecoming of everyone involved. Ida's voice rang out above the growing murmurs of the class rep now standing from his desk as well and chopping the air with his hand. Nizu has vouched for Izuku and trusts him. There is no reason for us not to do the same. Izuku abruptly stopped fighting against Katsuki, turning to face Ida instead with a shocked expression. Ida had been one of the ones hanging back, as of late, and watching everyone else interact with the teen. Ida, thank you. Izuku's voice was trembling a little and Katsuki didn't need to turn around to know there were tears threatening to spill. Enough of this. I am in charge of this class and he is leaving immediately. All Might's voice boomed, the man himself seemingly losing what little composure he had left. You know, when people have to yell that they're in charge, that usually means they have no control over anything. Shinso drawled somewhere behind Katsuki, earning a few snickers from the class. I am bringing Aizawa here now to end this nonsense and cancel whatever quirk this villain is using to trick all of you into defending him. All Might finally snapped, a frightening glare settling on his face. Katsuki felt the way Izuku tensed up behind him, could feel the tiny tremors that racked the teen's body and instinctively knew he was going to do something impulsive. something he was going to regret later. He didn't get the chance to turn or even attempt to stop the other teen, though, because Izuku silenced the entire classroom with a single sentence. I mean, sure, do that, but it won't do much good since I'm quirkless. I mean, sure, do that, but it won't do much good since I'm quirkless. Izuku wasn't sure what possessed him to use that particular fact to sass the former #1 hero, but the moment the words were out of his mouth he regretted them. The murmurs that had been building during the entire confrontation died completely at his words. Tears that had threatened to spill when Ida of all people stood up for him built up again, burning at the back of his eyes. He couldn't cry right now. Not in front of All Might and surely not in front of the class. He couldn't be weak. They probably hated him now anyway, though. No one ever treated him the same after finding out. It was going to SCK so much worse this time, though. Everyone was going to side with All Might now because obviously he was a problem. He just hoped he'd have more time to be their friend before he was forced to tell them how broken he was. His vision was darkening at the edges as his panic set in, breath stuttering in his effort not to break down. The hand on his elbow loosened and gently slid down his arm to tangle their fingers together. The small squeeze the other teen gave his hand pulled him out of his panic a little, green eyes wide as they met the stormy red of Katsuki's. Kaken's expression was worried, obviously not liking whatever he saw in Izuku's own expression. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to run away. He wanted to not be in this situation. Before he could open his mouth and put his foot back into it, Katsuki's gaze snapped away from him to scan the crowd of students once more. Something in his gaze relaxed at what he found, and even though it made Izuku curious, he couldn't bring himself to look himself. It would break him to see any ounce of rejection on his new friends' faces. Anyone got a problem with the nerd because he lacks a stupid DMN quirk? If so, you go through me. The words were growled out, Katsuki's grip on his hand tightening for a second before becoming gentle again. Young Midoriya. All Might's voice drew Izuku's gaze to him again, and what he saw there had his stomach dropping all over again. The recognition that the teen had been dreading in the beginning was now there, and it just made the panic lingering at the edges of his senses that much worse. How many times does he have to tell you his name is Izuku? A hand came to rest on his shoulder as Shinso spoke, giving a small comforting squeeze even while the purple-haired teen glared at All Might. You should choose your next words carefully, too, since you're coming dangerously close to sounding quirkist. For a second there, it sounded like you were accusing him of brainwashing us. All Might's face drained of color and he cleared his throat awkwardly, seemingly trying to find a way to control the situation again. The class started to rise from their seats, a few more hands coming from all around Izuku to ruffle his hair or pat his back or shoulders as the students tried their best to comfort the teen. They didn't seem to have words yet, still processing the ongoing mess that this lesson had turned out to be, but the silent support brought tears back to Izuku's eyes. Be that as it may, a villain has no place among hero students. No matter what you've tricked these children into thinking. All Might's face settled back into the grim frown he'd been wearing before, drawing himself up to his full height. And if you are quirkless, as you claim to be, then that's even more reason to find somewhere more suitable for you. Think of how they would feel if they were to injure you severely because you cannot protect yourself. 3 years ago, Izuku might have flinched at his words. He might have taken them to heart and shrunk into himself and made an excuse to step away from the comforting hands and people surrounding him. 3 years ago, he didn't know that he could be strong. But in the past 3 years he'd survived against people with quirks. He'd outsmarted more of them than he'd overpowered, yes, but he could hold his own against someone like Shigaraki and had earned himself the position he was in. Just because one muscle-bound idiot couldn't deal with it didn't mean he hadn't done everything he'd done to get himself to where he was standing right this moment. Hadn't he already let this man's opinion of him hurt him for long enough? He had the support of the people that mattered. Finally gathering the courage, he turned his head to look at everyone that had gathered around him. Shinso was on his right, hand slipping off of his shoulder to take his hand as well and giving it a gentle squeeze. Izuku flashed him a small smile. Beyond Shinso, he could see Kaminari and Kirishima glaring at All Might fiercely, Jiru and Mina with hands on their arms to keep them from storming forward. Turning a little more, Ida and Uraraka were behind him with Siro standing near Kaken's other side. If Izuku had to guess, the black-haired teen was going to hold the explosive blonde back if he made a leap for All Might. He'd have to thank him for that later. The rest of the class was gathered around them, all either glaring at All Might or watching the interaction uneasily. Yaoyorozu was ringing. Her hands nervously, eyes dancing back and forth between All Might and the classroom door like she wanted to run for an authority figure. Next to her, Todoroki was as blank-faced as usual, but Izuku could see the tense lines of his shoulders and the way he'd angled himself to better be able to ice someone over if things went wrong. Izuku made a mental note to put more effort into befriending the youngest Todoroki before turning back to face All Might. The youngest Todoroki hardened his resolve as well. Dabi hadn't put all the work and time and attention into helping him survive just for him to roll over and give up now. Even if he and the burned man weren't on speaking terms, Izuku had to at least honor the man's want for him to spit in the world's eye and keep moving when it told him what he could or couldn't do. "With all due respect, sir, that's not for you to decide," he said finally, squeezing Katsuki and Shinsu's hands back and squaring his shoulders. "As you've been told no less than 3 times in the past few minutes, Nizu put me in this position and only he can dismiss me from it. I'm here to help everyone in this room survive in the mess you've created, oh mighty symbol of peace." Izuku met the man's gaze evenly, chin tilted up defiantly as he stepped forward and dropped the hands he was holding. He could feel the entire class shift behind him, closing ranks and very firmly showing the man where they stood in this matter. "You don't get to come in here and lecture me or them on how to do the job. The world they are going to be heroes in is going to be so unlike the one you worked in because of you and not in a good way. They need as much help as possible to be ready for the danger they're going to be stepping into." Izuku's resolve continued to solidify as he spoke, his tone turning to steel and his spin filling with it as well. "You can continue to call me a villain if you want, but at the end of the day I'm going to be the one giving them a realistic idea of what to expect out there, not you. So I suggest you think very carefully about your next words." His chest heaved a little as silence settled over the classroom, both of them glaring at each other. Vaguely, he heard Shinso whistle lowly behind him and could have almost heard Kaken growl something about dibs. He couldn't be sure about that last part, though, because the moment his brain tried to process it, another voice spoke up from the door of the classroom. "Very well said." The squeaky voice of the principal broke the tension into a million pieces as every eye turned to the doorway with varying degrees of relief. The rat stood on Hisashi's shoulders, grinning brightly at his student before his gaze turned to the former #1 hero. "All Might, I believe you and I need to have a quick chat. Yamada will take over this class for today." The tone the principal used brokered no discussion. All Might slumped and shot Izuku one last lingering look before he turned and headed towards the door. Nizu transferred from Hisashi's shoulder to All Might's, paw coming up to grip at his hair in a way that Izuku vaguely noted was probably not comfortable. Now that the confrontation was over, though, he didn't have much brain power left. The energy he'd found there at the end drained out of him, and he slumped a little, one hand coming up to rub over his face and then to tug at his hair. All of this had gotten so out of hand so quickly. It felt like everything had changed in the blink of an eye. He was broken out of his hazy thoughts as Hisashi stepped further into the classroom, coming to stand in front of him and gently pull his hand out of his hair. The blonde hero replaced it with his own, petting the teen's hair gently and pulling him closer to him. Izuku wanted desperately to grab hold of his leather jacket and not let go, but, turning his head, he could see the strange looks the class was giving them. Sure, it would be normal for Shoyuta to act this way, kind of. Everyone in class kind of knew that they were close, but they'd never seen him interact with Hisashi. It would be weird, and it wasn't something he could explain without outing him and Shoyuta. He wouldn't be the one to cause the men who'd given him something he hadn't realized he craved trouble. Even though it pained him, he pulled away a little and flashed Hisashi a small smile to show he was okay. Later he would break down. Later. In the safety of the apartment where he couldn't put their secret in jeopardy. Hisashi seemed to understand immediately but surprised Izuku by rolling his eyes and pulling the teen in again and wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "Oh little listener, it's okay. We already figured Shuta's hell class was going to find out, one way or the other." Hisashi's voice was low enough for only Izuku to hear, but the message was somewhat clear to everyone else as Izuku sagged against the voice hero, tears finally falling from his eyes as he buried his face in the man's chest. "I knew it," Kaminari crowed, smacking Kirishima and doing some sort of little victory dance. "I told you him and Aizawa were dating." Kirishima groaned loudly and pushed the electric blonde away from him before digging in his pockets. Fine. I don't have the money on me, you're gonna have to wait till we get back to the dorms, bro." As the redhead grumbled, the rest of the class shook off the tense energy of before and surged forward to surround the voice hero and Izuku. Sniffling, Izuku pulled away a little to aim a watery smile up at the man who just laughed and ruffled his hair gently. "What even happened, little listeners? It looked mighty tense in here when we walked in." Hizashi glanced around at the assembled students, taking in the way their faces fell at the mention of the encounter. "But might as a quirkist be yesterday is what happened." Shinsu's voice was angry and his face was pinched. Katsuki was staring at him with an unreadable expression before turning back towards Izuku, once again reaching out to take his hand. Izuku didn't shake him off, instead offering him a watery smile. He didn't have the energy to try and figure out the other's emotions right now, but the contact was nice and settled him in a way he couldn't and didn't have the heart to quantify right now. He kept calling Izuku a villain and saying he didn't belong here. Kirishima piped up next, arms crossed over his chest. It was so unmanly. He even tried to say he couldn't be here because he didn't have a quirk. Hizashi's eyes roved over the entire class, taking in the angry and unsettled expressions of each student before sighing and glancing back down at Izuku. He didn't seem upset with him, at least, so Izuku was going to try his best not to overthink the expression on the man's face. If he was honest with himself, he just really wanted to curl up in the dorms and recharge. There was too much to pick apart right now and his mind was too exhausted to try and figure out where to go from here. "Alright, I don't think we're going to get much done after all of that drama. I'm going to text Aizawa and let him know we're going back to the dorms early. You guys pack up and head back that way now and Izuku and I will follow in a few minutes." The class all nodded and moved back towards their desks. Katsuki seemed torn, but a small smile and a squeeze of his hand seemed to convince him that Izuku would be okay. The blonde reluctantly let go of him and moved away, packing up and leaving with only a backward glance with the rest of the class. Everyone made a point to either pat Izuku on the shoulder or back as they passed or ruffle his hair. It was not nice. He was too tired to think further on it, though, leaning against Hizashi as the last of the students filed out of the room. The man didn't rush him, instead humming a song to himself as he gently pet Izuku's hair while the teen pulled himself together. "They're going to have questions," he mumbled after a few minutes, rubbing at his face and slumping further against the blonde. His sort of father figure just hummed an affirmative and nudged him to stand on his own. "They will. But show Yuta and I will be there with you to help keep them in line, and it won't be until you've at least had a nap, little man." Izuku nodded at his words, not protesting as the adult herded him out of the classroom and in the direction of the dorms. That was a problem for future Izuku. Everyone returned to the dorms and collectively decided to set up camp in the common room. As promised, Izuku and Present Mike returned, but the blonde man waved them away when everyone rose to greet them. One look at Izuku and everyone understood. His eyes were red-rimmed and he looked like he was about to drop. Present Mike was practically holding up the teenager. Everyone hovered nervously as the man shot them a small smile and guided the exhausted teen away from them and down the hall towards Aizawa's apartment. Well, their apartment. All settled once more, spreading out homework and other things around the tables and couches as they settled in to wait. It didn't take long, though, for them to get restless. Katsuki could feel their eyes on him, and it was wearing on his nerves with every minute that ticked by. His leg began to bounce under the table he was sitting at and his grip grew tighter on the pencil in his hand. When the chair in front of him slid out and a body dropped into it, he barely resisted the urge to snap the object in his hand. It was an accomplishment that he'd brag about to his therapist in their next session. Especially when he raised his gaze to find Shinso sitting across from him, a smirk tugging at his lips. Normally, he didn't mind the purple troll doll. He was nowhere near as annoying as some of the extras in 1B and miles above the dumbass he'd replaced after the sports festival. Right now, though? Now he kind of wanted to set an explosion off in his face to get rid of that DMN smirk. So, care to explain what exactly that was all about? Katsuki could feel every eye in the room turn to them. He could feel the irritation in himself rising and forced it down once more. What they'd just seen was disturbing and he couldn't blame them for wanting answers. He just didn't know if he was the right one to give them those answers. Ever heard of the old saying, never meet your heroes? Guess we learned the hard way that they never live up to expectations. Katsuki grumbled, dropping his gaze back down to the homework in front of him. Shinso leaned against the table, leaning into Katsuki's space. The demed smirk fell off his face and was replaced with a more serious expression. Bakugo, we both know that's not what I was talking about. When the blonde looked up to meet his gaze again, the other teen's expression was searching. Katsuki couldn't fault him for trying to understand what the hell had happened in that classroom. He himself was trying to wrap his head around it with the limited pieces of the puzzle he held. You know he was a villain, right? Nothing murder level or anything but enough that he and Krusty the Ass Clown are hostile on sight. Katsuki didn't lower his voice, knowing damn well that the rest of the class was listening in on the conversation. When they kidnapped me, he bust into the bar and threw a FING knife at Shigaraki's face. The look of awe on Troll Doll's face made Katsuki want to throw something, but instead he just drummed his fingers against the table unhappily. Get that stupid look off your face, troll? He grumbled, glaring with all the energy he could muster at the moment. Instead of the desired effect of making the idiot stop, it just made his lips quirk up in that stupid FING smirk. Oh, am I not allowed to find him attractive? Because from where I sit he looks pretty unattached. Katsuki's lips pulled up in a snarl, and he was halfway out of his seat when a hand came to rest on his shoulder and Kirishima's voice registered. Through the haze of anger. Dude, not cool. The last thing Izuburo is worrying about right now is dating, I think. Shinso lifted his hands in surrender, but the smirk only grew when Katsuki growled at him as he dropped back into his chair heavily. How did he get from the bar all the way out to that warehouse, though? Uraraka settled into a chair on the other side of Katsuki, brows furrowed. It wasn't exactly close enough that he could have gotten there so quickly. All for one, the villain that but might fought, apparently wanted to talk to Izuku and made the warp villain bring him over to him. I'm guessing that's why he was all bent out of shape about Izuku being on campus. Katsuki slumped in his chair a little, fingers tapping against his leg, the only other sign he was agitated. The other students were gathered around their table now, leaning against the other nearby tables or just milling around listening to the conversation. That's not exactly fair to Izuku. That guy leveled part of a city. Who knows what he'd do if someone told him no? Shiro mumbled from the other side of Katsuki. There were murmured agreements from the other teens, and Katsuki found his gaze jumping from person to person, searching. As much as he didn't want to broach the subject, he had to. There was no way he was going to let Izuku walk into this room and be met with the same kind of bullshit that caused him to disappear in the first place. Slowly, Katsuki stood up and met each of their eyes. Several of his classmates looked confused and others looked wary. While he wasn't as volatile and angry as he had been in the past, the class was still used to him exploding verbally instead of the quiet intensity he was exuding right this moment. Listen up, fuckers, I'm only going to say this once. If any of you have a problem with Izuku or are going to be quirkistifus, you either keep it to yourself or deal with me. His tone brokered no arguments, gaze serious and sharp as it roved around the gathered students. Several voices sounded at once, many indignant and a couple of them annoyingly cooing at him. Like we'd have an issue with Sunshine Boy. Katsuki met Jiru's gaze and her unimpressed eye roll drew a small snort from him. Besides, you said he threw a knife at Shigaraki's face. I don't know about anyone else, but I'm not gonna be the one to suggest he's anything but a badass. Kaminari grinned as he said it, drawing a laugh from a few of the others. Katsuki relaxed a little, shoving his hands in his pockets and letting his posture slump again. But he doesn't need more people being assholes. He grumbled, not meeting their eyes because he could see the teasing smiles popping up on his friends' and classmates' faces. There was no way he was dealing with this much emotion. He's so soft for the Sunshine Boy. Mina cooed, reaching out to poke him playfully. Growling, he slapped her hands away and dropped back down into his chair. Shut up, no one is to mention this conversation ever again. Go back to studying or whatever. Several hours later found Izuku bundled up in blankets curled up between Shoyuta and Hisashi on the sofa, his head on Shuta's lap as they watched some pre-quirk superhero movie. Izuku had napped for a little while, but the anxiety of the entire situation was quick to descend on him once he was fully awake. Honestly, the impromptu cuddle pile was the only thing keeping Shoyuta from finding the former #1 hero and ripping him a new one. Nizu had already given him a brief rundown of what had happened before he'd left the school, and he'd hurried back to the apartment when Hisashi had told him he'd dismissed class for the day. Izuku glanced up at him through his hair before sighing and pushing himself up to sit properly between the two adults. As much as he'd like to rest for longer, the anxiety just built worse and worse with each passing minute. Both adults turned their attention to him and he flashed them a small smile. "They have questions," he said simply, shrugging the blankets off of himself and pushing himself to his feet. Shuta's eyes followed him critically, no doubt taking in the bags forming under his eyes and the way his fingers tugged and pulled at the sleeves of his hoodie. They hadn't given him his knives back yet, and he honestly longed for the weight of them between his fingers. He didn't know when they'd become a comfort item, but he missed them dearly now that he didn't have access to them. Answers they don't absolutely need. Don't push yourself if you don't need to. Shoyuta rumbled, reaching out to snag Izuku's wrist and attempting to pull him back down onto the sofa. Izuku resisted, planting his feet and shooting the man a small smile. It was nice to be fussed over, honestly. Especially after the day he'd had. But he wasn't going to be able to relax until he dealt with this. If he didn't face them now, he'd have to deal with the anxiety of not knowing their reactions all night. And that was not even a little bit restful. The longer I put it off, the worse it's gonna be. He laughed softly at the grumpy look on Shuta's face. You know they won't let me rest until I give them some kind of answers. Better to get it over with now, before they can think of more. Hisashi huffed out a laugh and extracted himself from his own blankets, reaching out to Shoyuta with a grin. The black-haired man rolled his eyes and huffed before taking his husband's hand and letting him pull him up from the sofa as well. Izuku took a moment to just watch them, already seeing the massive reaction the class was going to have at seeing both of them in their comfy clothes. Hisashi's hair was down and free, all of the gel he'd used that day washed out, while Shuta's was pulled up and away from his face. He'd only been with the couple for 2 weeks, but already he knew he'd do anything to protect their little bubble. And yet, here they were, ready to reveal the full extent of their relationship to the class just so they could support him. He couldn't fathom why they bothered with him. Why they were so good and kind to him. Before he realized it, hot tears were washing down his face again, and he hurried to cover his face before either man noticed. Unfortunately, the motion itself brought their attention back to him, and Hisashi let out a small, distressed noise as he stepped back towards Izuku. "Oh no, Aizu. What's wrong? We don't have to do this," like Sho said. Izuku shook his head quickly, breath hitching again as Shoyuta stepped up next to his husband and gripped the teen's shoulder gently. No. He hiccuped out, shaking his head quickly. "I just thought sorry. Both of you are so amazing. I'm sorry I'm ruining everything." Understanding flashed over Shuta's face and he gently pulled Izuku to his chest, wrapping his arm around him and even more gently carding his fingers through his curls. Hisashi flashed him a concerned look over the kid's head, but Izuku couldn't see it, face buried in the man's chest as he tried to stem the flow of tears pouring from his eyes. "You're not ruining anything, kid," the man rumbled, rocking a little with the teen. "We're doing this because we care about you. Sure, it's gonna be annoying to have to deal with Kaminari's remarks and Ishido's gossip-mongering ways, but we already knew this was going to become common knowledge at some point. And if it's because we're supporting our favorite kid in the world, then that's even better." Hisashi's voice drew Izuku's face away from Shuta's chest, green eyes flooding with tears again as he reached out to drag the blonde man into the hug as well. "We're not supposed to have favorites, Zashi. I'm sorry, my kid is always going to be my favorite." Between the two of them, Izuku froze up as the words processed. He couldn't have said what he thought he said. No way. Because there was no way either of these amazing heroes thought of him like that. Silence settled over them and the men shared a concerned look again, unsure of how to react to the slip-up. "Kid, talk to us," Shoyuta said softly, pulling back a little to try and get a look at the teen's face. "That you don't have to, I'm not. It's sweet but you don't have to lie to me," Izuku mumbled, not meeting either of their gazes and slowly pulling away now that Shoyuta was no longer boxing him in between the two of them. The teen flinched when two hands came up to cup his face, the touch light but strong enough to force him to meet the man's eyes. Hizashi had tears building in his eyes, and when Izuku glanced away from him, unable to look at it, he was almost horrified to see the sad look on Shuta's face. What had he said? Did he hurt their feelings by calling them on the lie? He hadn't meant to do that. He just wanted to make sure they knew he didn't need to be coddled. He understood. No one wanted a quirkless, villain kid. He got it. It was such a nice thought, though. Izuku. No, I wasn't just saying that. Hizashi drew Izuku's attention back to him, eyes so sincere that Izuku couldn't force himself to interrupt the man again. Honestly, it felt like his brain stopped working as he waited for the man to continue speaking. "Yes, we've only known you for a little while, but both of us would fight all might for you if you wanted us to." The statement drew a watery giggle from the teenager, bordering on hysterical. "So yeah, you're our kid? We'd adopt you legally, but since you're a problem child, that's a little impossible at the moment." Shuta's voice was dry as he stepped in again to settle his hand back into the teen's curls. "But don't you dare think we're just doing something to be nice or out of some obligation. We don't do anything we don't want to." Izuku couldn't answer, curling into himself and trying not to let the floodgates open back up completely. If he was asked to describe how he was feeling, he wouldn't have been able to. Joy welled up in his chest, making him warm and floaty like Uraraka had used her quirk on him. The anxiety was still clawing at the back of his mind, though. Both men waited, though, for him to compose himself a little more. Shoyuta pet his hair lightly and Hizashi hummed a quiet tune, hand rubbing gently along Izuku's shoulders. Their presence helped ease the anxiety a little, letting it fade to the background so he could enjoy the moment. "Maybe we let Midoriya Izuku stay dead and see if Nizu will help me hack into some really illegal places to make a new identity?" he asked hopefully, grinning a little when Shoyuta groaned and pushed his head down. "I knew letting you near Nizu was a bad idea. I knew it the moment he offered his little devil paw to you." The underground hero threw his hands up in the air, causing his husband to snort out a laugh. "Chaos. Both of them." Izuku couldn't help but laugh, leaning into Hizashi and watching Shoyuta as he lamented the corruption of his child by the rat. "Come on, then, problem child. When I went through the common room earlier, they all looked like they were sitting on live wires." Shoyuta turned at those words and held the front door of the apartment open, looking put out about the whole situation. Chuckling, Hizashi led Izuku out of the door. The teen ducked his head when Shoyuta ruffled his hair again before falling in step with them. As they rounded the corner into the common room, Izuku couldn't help the smile on his face. Shoyuta and Hizashi stood on either side of him, shoulders brushing, as every eye in the common room swung around to them. "Hi guys. You probably have some questions for me." It took a few minutes for everyone to pile into the common area comfortably, everyone either sitting on the floor in the middle of the couches or on the couches themselves. Izuku himself sat on a couch, Hizashi and Shoyuta on either side of him. Katsuki had decided to act even more like a guard dog and sat on the floor in front of him, shoulder pressed against his leg. Izuku pointedly ignored the kissy faces and smug looks from the class at that and instead shot Katsuki a bright smile. Once everyone was settled, Izuku looked out over all of the faces eagerly watching and not for the first time wondered if he'd bitten off more than he could chew. Taking a deep breath, he leaned against Hizashi for a moment and tried to think calm thoughts. He'd had an idea of how to tackle this, but now with everyone looking to him for direction, it was more than a little intimidating. Which was mind-boggling because he'd faced off against all kinds of things in the past 3 years and survived. Yet 19 teenagers were going to be what scared him the most. Make it make sense. Who wants to go first? The words were barely out of his mouth when Ida's hand shot in the air, the teen almost rising from his seat in his eagerness. Izuku was not surprised, had even counted on this. He had a good feeling of what the uptight teen was going to ask as well, and steeled himself for the inevitable as he pointed to him. "Forgive me for prying, Izuku, but I feel the need to ask this, so I will try and be as tactful as possible." The class president rose from his seat carefully as he spoke, adjusting his glasses nervously. "How did all of this start? I'm finding myself unable to see how someone like yourself could end up with such a high villain ranking." Izuku relaxed a little, secretly relieved that the teen had phrased the question as tactfully as he had. A part of him expected an outburst like the first day of class. It still didn't make answering the question any easier, but that was a whole other matter. Especially when he could feel Kaken tensing up as he waited for Izuku to drop the hammer, so to speak. It was a good thing Izuku had already forgiven the blonde's teen actions, otherwise this would get really ugly really quickly. "Well, it all started when I was 4 years old and diagnosed quirkless." He laughed a little, leaning forward a little and daring to run his fingers over the hair on the back of Katsuki's neck, hoping he would understand that he could relax. There were scattered laughs from the class and Izuku flashed them a small smile. Really though, it did kind of start there. No one is exactly welcoming of quirkless kids these days. We're not common in this generation and we're sort of seen as inferior and useless. The somber nature of the topic settled in over the class and Izuku could feel the tension in Katsuki's shoulders and neck rising, either in worry about what he was about to say or upset at the topic at hand. Izuku couldn't tell, but he could also feel the hand Shoyuta placed on his back to steady him, the underground hero having some idea of where this was going. Izuku could do this. He could tell this version of the story. So yeah, not really a pleasant way to grow up, you know? I was mostly okay until one day in the beginning of my second year of middle school. On my way home, a villain tried to use me as a shield. Against a hero that was chasing them, Izuku paused to gather his thoughts, making sure the way he bit his lip and twisted his fingers into the back Katsuki's shirt made it seem like he was just unhappy reliving the memory and not just thinking over the way to word his next statement. He had a plan, and this next part was going to be crucial to it. When the villain was contained, I took the opportunity to ask that hero if someone like me, quirkless, could still be a hero. They didn't exactly sugarcoat what they thought of that. He gave the class a sad smile, not really having to fake this part. Just remembering the man's words that day made him want to curl up in a ball and cry all over again. He didn't think he'd ever be able to shake the intense reaction to the words, "Be realistic." He couldn't have known, of course, that I wasn't exactly mentally sound at the moment, but he left me alone and I kind of spiraled. The hand on his back gripped at the back of his hoodie and Izuku couldn't help but peek up at Shoyuta out of the corner of his eye, taking in the absolute rage shining in his dark eyes. That was surprising. He looked away quickly and cleared his throat, shifting a little so he could pet Katsuki's hair a little more to calm himself. It was a testament to how upset the rest of the class was that no one made a comment on it, all of them silent and staring at him with troubled looks. He hadn't really thought they'd be this upset by his words. Even Katsuki was just letting him do as he pleased with his hair as he talked. Maybe that this hadn't been the best plan of action? Sorry, I got off topic a little. Long story much shorter, I attempted to hurt myself that night and someone stopped me. Someone. With less than healthy disregard for the law? That works. He patched me up and gave me a place to stay when I decided I didn't want to go home. There was no way he was name-dropping Dabi in this room right this moment. Not when he could feel Shoyuta and Hisashi's eyes on him and the tension in Katsuki in front of him. Things kind of spiraled from there. I mostly traded information in the underground and sometimes did favors for people. My villain rank is mostly because I know too much about too many people. He tried desperately not to stare directly at Shudo when he said this, but his gaze drifted that way anyway. The dual-quirk teenager's face was as blank as it ever was, but he thought for a moment he saw a flash of recognition there. Maybe it was wishful thinking? The silence that fell over the room was stifling, as the other teenagers let this new view of him sink in. He couldn't help but bounce his leg nervously. They didn't seem to be reacting to the quirkless thing badly, but he couldn't help but worry that the coddling was going to start soon. Inevitably, if people didn't leave him, they started to treat him like he couldn't be trusted to care for himself. Uraraka's voice pulled him from his thoughts, his gaze snapping to her face and taking in the sad look on her face. His stomach sank a little at the expression. While he needed to drop these breadcrumbs, he hadn't wanted any of them to be this affected by even part of that story. You wanted to be a hero? The question she voiced brought a sad smile back to his face. More than anything. It was all I talked about, honestly. I'd go find villain fights to watch and analyze so I could learn as much as I could about different fighting styles and strategies. He could feel Katsuki's snort more than he heard it, and the smile morphed into a shyer smile as the blonde teen tipped his head back so Izuku could see him roll his eyes at him. I even got scolded by local heroes because I may have ran onto a scene once to try and help since none of their quirks were suited to what was going on. Katsuki tensed again at the reminder of his encounter with the sludge villain, but Izuku breezed past it, fingers smoothing through the other teen's hair again in an attempt to soothe the memory away. The rest of the class didn't notice the interaction, instead laughing a little and relaxing at what they assumed was a minor infraction. Izuku wasn't going to force Katsuki to relive that incident again, so he let the atmosphere ease again and tried not to look at either of his new parental units whose eyes were boring into him. He could guess what was on their minds and what their suspicions were, but he wasn't going to have those discussions in front of the rest of the class. So, when are you joining the hero course, then? It was Shinso who spoke up this time, a challenging light in his eye as he stared Izuku down. All eyes immediately settled on Izuku again, eager for his answer. Several people around the room, the members of the Baku squad if Izuku had to guess, whooped at the idea of it, and Izuku had to force himself not to wince. That was honestly not something he thought the class would ask him. That's not exactly in my plans, he said, shifting nervously and pointedly not meeting anyone's eye. What? Why not? You'd make such a kick-ass hero. Bakugo said you threw a knife at Shigaraki's face. Kaminari was the loudest voice Izuku heard, and his entire face felt like it was on fire as his gaze snapped down to Katsuki. The blonde just smirked at him. Several other voices sounded in with their agreements, and the green-haired teen had to actively work to keep tears at bay. Never in a million years had he thought any of them would be encouraging about this. None of them were laughing at him. None of them were telling him to be realistic. Guys, I thank you for thinking so highly of me, but it's just not something I can realistically do. As soon as the words were out of his mouth, he had to hold up both of his hands to call for quiet because of the explosion of sound that took place. He had to raise his voice, even then, to be heard over the other teenagers protesting. For one, a hero license is a license to use your quirk. To do hero work. That's not something I qualify for. There were still grumbles from around the room, and Izuku couldn't stop the smile that bloomed on his face. Yes, they were idealistic and naive, but it was nice that even in such a short time of knowing him they were fully in his corner. If he had any doubts before, they were banished now. Which, yes, I could fight the commission and probably win, but I don't have that much fight left in me. His tone grew somber once more as his gaze traveled over the group. I'm more than happy to do my job here. All of you are going to be amazing heroes and take the hero industry by storm. That's my focus right now. Looking around the room, he could see a few like Aoyama and Kirishima tearing up, and the rest were staring at him with wide eyes and open mouths. Next to him, Hizashi was sniffling a little, and Izuku knew if he looked over the man would be fighting back tears. Which was the exact reason Izuku wasn't looking back at him. He didn't need a full-blown crying session right now. That would come later, he was sure. Katsuki's mind wandered as the questions got less serious and more silly. He was comfortable, Izuku's fingers playing with his hair every now and then helping him relax back against the couch. His eyes settled once or twice on classmates who weren't paying attention, several times subtly flipping the bird to one of his idiots when they made a face at him or wagged their eyebrows. He wasn't going to apologize for being comfortable. Nor was he going to tell Izuku to stop what he was doing. The one time, though, that his gaze fell on Troll Doll, he had to force himself not to react to the stupid smirk he was shooting him. Especially when he looked back a few minutes later and the purple-haired troll was paying attention to Izuku again with that stupid look of awe again. Like hell was he going to lose his nerd to that? Unfortunately, Kaminari was going to lose his life tonight, since when Katsuki did tune back in, the blonde was grinning as he asked if Izuku was a top or a bottom. Luckily for the electric quirked blonde, Aizawa reacted first. The man stood up and glared down at Kaminari, silent for a very long moment, before declaring the questions done and over with. Present Mike laughed and stood as well and, to the excitement of the entire class, grabbed the underground hero by the hand and gently tugged him away from the group. Katsuki could practically feel Mina vibrating from where she was sitting. The girl wasn't one to gloat when she was right, but since she'd called this since the beginning of the year, Katsuki could let her gloat a little. Just a little. He didn't want to have to hear Kirishima whine about it later. He was pulled out of his thoughts when Izuku's fingers combed through his hair again, drawing his head back so he could get a look at his face. "You seem rather comfortable down there, Kaken." The green-haired teen was grinning at him, and Katsuki was so comfortable he couldn't do much more than admire that smile. It was a couple hours after his bedtime, so maybe that's why his insides felt so mushy and he couldn't bring himself to muster up any annoyance at their classmates cooing at them from just out of earshot. He was also going to blame his being tired for reaching up to grab Izuku's hand as it exited his hair and tangling their fingers together. "Hey, the old hag wants to see you." He kept his head tilted back, watching the uncomfortable look that bloomed over Izuku's face. "You don't have to if you don't want to, but her and the old man were happy to hear you were okay, and she, I quote, wants to make sure those BSers at that school are treating him right." Izuku's face relaxed and he smiled down at him, not answering his question for the moment but instead playing with his fingers gently. Katsuki let himself drift as he waited, just kind of idly taking in the soft little bubble that had surrounded them. He was vaguely aware of the others kind of lingering in the background, but he couldn't really bring himself to care about them right now. "If you say yes, we could go out to eat or something afterward." He blurted out, the nice little thought overriding his brain-to-mouth filter. For a brief second he wanted to take the words back, shove them back into his mouth somehow or something, but the way Izuku's face slowly turned red and he hid his face with his free hand was worth it. He couldn't help himself and lifted up his own free hand to poke at the bit of Izuku's cheek that he could see. "Is that a yes?" "Ha! Kaken, you can't just blurt something like that out. Especially in the context of going to see your mom before that." Izuku's face was still bright red, but he freed both of his hands to shove them in Katsuki's face in an attempt to stop him from smirking up at him again. "Look how cute." Mina's squeal broke the little bubble they were in, both boys jumping guiltily as they turned to look at her. Izuku's hands on Katsuki's shoulders were the only thing keeping him from hopping up off of the floor and flying after her when he noticed her phone was out. Undoubtedly there were some sickly sweet pictures of them both on that phone and he had to destroy it. No one could have proof that King Explosion murder could be soft. Mina escaped with phone intact, though, because Izuku shifted his hands from Katsuki's shoulders to his arms wrapped around his shoulders. Unable to move, obviously, the explosive teen relaxed back against the sofa again and only glanced up at the other when his grip loosened. What he saw was Izuku descending into nerves, biting his lip and not looking at Katsuki. With a huff the blonde pulled himself up onto the sofa with the green-haired teen and reached out to tangle their fingers together again. "What's up, nerd? Is it my parents or me asking you out?" He kept his tone soft and waited while the other seemed to put his words together. It took a moment before the other had his thoughts in line and gave Katsuki's hand a squeeze. "Are you sure you want to? I'm more trouble than I'm worthy, especially for you." The words were mumbled and made Katsuki's hand tighten involuntarily, the words so wrong he actually kind of wanted to physically fight them. "I'm still considered a villain outside these walls. If anyone, or God forbid, the commission found out your career would be over before it started." "Bullshit." Katsuki grit the word out like it had personally offended him. "Look, I'm not good with words, and shit. You of all people know this, but if you think I'm gonna let something like that stop me from getting what I want, then you're an idiot." Izuku blinked at him, taken aback for a moment, and for a brief second Katsuki thought he might have gone too far. Biting his own lip, he pulled the other closer and forced himself to calm down. Words were needed here. More than maybe he could nicely say, but goddamn it, he was going to try. "What I mean is, I don't see you as trouble. You're my hero." He had to look away from the look on Izuku's face, afraid that the tears building in the other teen's eyes would trigger his own. "You literally came back from the dead to try and save me from a literal group of villains. Don't think I don't know who came up with that crazy but plan, Izuku. If you think I'm letting anyone, commission or no, tell me that I have to let you go in any capacity. You're crazy. Izuku squeezed his hands so tightly that Katsuki had to peek back at the other, surprised to find that he wasn't crying but instead grinning at him with watery eyes. Then yes, Kaken, I want to go to dinner with you after going to visit your parents. Luckily, by time Izuku had extracted himself from the sofa and the soft atmosphere that had built around himself and Katsuki, it was quite late. Everyone had split apart and were slowly making their way out of the common areas and into their dorms. When he pushed open the door to the apartment, he could see that Shoyuta was already preparing for his patrol and Hisashi was going through his nightly routine. The team paused in the doorway for a moment, watching the older men talk quietly. Shoyuta was still tense from whatever questions he still had for Izuku, but he and Hisashi's fingers were tangled together and he leaned in when Hisashi asked for a kiss. It was nice to see them so domestic. And he was glad he hadn't interrupted their routine or dynamic too much. They'd been so kind to him thus far that he wouldn't be able to stand it if he put any kind of strain on them or their relationship. It didn't take long for the two to notice his entrance, Hisashi noticing first and flashing him a soft smile. The blonde motioning him forward grabbed Shuta's attention and Izuku hesitated when those dark eyes fell on him. They were full of questions and the embers of the anger he'd seen there earlier in the night. He knew the anger wasn't directed at him, but it still made him antsy. The man seemed to realize that and gave him a small smile and reached out to him with his free hand. Izuku reached out with his own, letting the man pull him closer to them both. You know we're going to have to talk about all of this at some point, right? Shoyuta asked, eyes searching and cataloging Izuku's response to his words. Izuku couldn't even be upset about it, really. He'd known this would be the most likely outcome of that particular breadcrumb. But he couldn't spill just yet. Not when the hero in question was so powerful and could literally help the Commission's efforts for him to disappear quietly along with everything he knew. As tedious and delicate as the job was, it had to be done right. I know. Izuku mumbled, dropping his gaze down to his feet in an attempt to hide from Shuta's gaze. Just stop, please, not tonight. I'm exhausted and I'd kind of agreed to go see Auntie Mitsuki with Kaken tomorrow. Both adults blinked at him, surprised, and he internally breathed a sigh of relief. At least with a change in subject he could dodge the questions he knew both of them had. Which means if I could pretty please have my knives back? He fumbled on forward, shooing Shoyuta the most pleading look he could manage at the moment. Since we're also going to get dinner afterwards? Immediately he could see that his wheedling had gone a step too far when Shuta's eyes blew wide again, and he tightened his grip on Izuku's hand. Absolutely not. No dating. No loud blondes. Not happening. Be the sensible one in this family, Izuku. Hisashi let out a snort, tugging his husband away from Izuku a little. He's allowed to date. It's a normal teenage thing. And the rules for dating are, no loud blondes. Bakugo is the loudest blonde in class. Oh, so if I were to date Shinso, that would be fine? Izuku asked innocently, fighting back the urge to smirk at the absolute indignation that covered the underground hero's face. That just feels wrong. No dating until you're 30. Izuku couldn't help the small smirk that tugged his lips up, kicking at the floor lightly as he thought about the best way to mess with the man. I mean, okay, but then I have to tell Kaken I can't go. It's such a shame since he asked me and all. He'll probably revert back to being emotionally constipated and be that much more of a handful in class. He hummed, watching Shuta's expression out of the corner of his eye. The man's eye twitched and he seemed to be looking skyward, possibly asking the universe what he'd done to be put in this kind of position. After a moment he huffed and reached out to pull Izuku into a one-armed hug. Fine, problem child, but I'm not giving you your knives back just for sassing me. He muttered, releasing him to lean over to get a kiss from Hisashi, ignoring the teenager's whine. Be good, kid, I'll see you in the morning. Shoyuta turned back and ruffled Izuku's hair before making his way out of the apartment. It was quiet for a moment, before Hisashi turned to the teenager and wagged his eyebrows at him, grinning. So? Shinso came out pretty fast when he shot down Bakugo. Nope. I'm going to bed. Good night. Standing on the doorstep of the Bakugo household, Izuku's anxiety spiked. Katsuki glanced at him, brow raised as he took in the way the green-haired teen squeezed his hand and stared at the front door like it was going to bite him or something. "Oi nerd, it'll be fine. They're excited to see you," he rumbled, knocking their shoulders together gently. The other teen just flashed him a wobbly smile before nodding that he was ready. If Katsuki hadn't heard and seen just how much his mom had worried about the other teen, he'd have suggested they just blow them off and go to the mall instead. But he honestly couldn't do that to the hag. When he'd called her to say that Izuku was coming with him, she sounded dim and near tears. Plus, she'd probably never let him live it down. He'd be hearing about it for the next 50 years. Squaring his shoulders, the teen pushed open the front door of the house and led Izuku inside. From the corner of his eye, he could see the other teen's head moving as he gawked at how much the decor had changed since the last time he'd been in the home. Katsuki rolled his eyes and tugged on his hand, pulling him further into the house and towards the kitchen. He could hear his mother's voice drifting from that direction. When they rounded the corner and stepped into the spacious kitchen, he was proven correct by the sight of his mother and father sitting at the table talking. His mother paused mid-sentence, staring at them over the old man's shoulder. It was silent in the room for a moment before she abruptly pushed away from the table and practically flew across the kitchen. "Izuku, I'm so happy to see you," she cried, enveloping the teen in a hug so fierce that Katsuki worried about the other's ribs. He was forced to let go of Izuku's hand and take a step back when his mother's gaze shifted to him. The look in her eyes told him that she'd seen it and there would be a conversation about it later. For the moment, though, she seemed content to let sleeping dogs lay and instead rocked Izuku side to side in her hug. When she finally did let go, she held the teenager at arm's length and took a good hard look at him. Her nose wrinkled when she took in the black hoodie he was always wearing paired with the too large t-shirt and jeans. "But we still need to work on your fashion sense, I see." Izuku laughed a little as the woman made another face before pulling him back into another quick hug. "Nothing we can't fix. You'll have to come back over break and we can take you out shopping." "There's no need for that, Auntie. Aizawa and Yamada bought me plenty of clothes. I just prefer comfort over looks." Katsuki couldn't help the snort that escaped him, shoving his hands into his pockets as he moved around his mother and friend to sit at the table with his father. "No wonder. Aizawa's practically adopted you. You're more similar to him than Troll Doll." The look his mother gave him was almost predatory as she dragged the green-haired teen over to the table as well. Both of his parents must have been expecting them around this town because there was tea set up in the center of the table. Katsuki didn't say anything as he reached out to start making his own cup, keeping an eye on Izuku out of the corner of his eye. The other teen had relaxed a little now that the hag wasn't actively trying to break his ribs. Though, he had taken note of the way Mitsuki had angelied her body towards him and was smiling at him in a way that was entirely too friendly. "Aizawa is the homeroom teacher, correct? The one who defended Katsuki at the press conference?" she asked, like she didn't already know the answer to that question. Katsuki could see a little of the tension returning to Izuku's shoulders and grit his teeth a little to keep himself from snapping at his mother. Izuku could handle Bakugo Mitsuki, he was sure. The last thing he needed was Katsuki being overbearing and trying to fight his battles for him. His therapist would be proud. Katsuki didn't need to be the loudest person in the room anymore. Yes, that would be him. Since he's the homeroom teacher for 1A, I'm under his custody. Izuku said slowly, eyeing Mitsuki carefully as he mimicked Katsuki and poured himself a cup of tea. "I am considering asking Nizu to allow me to stay with him full-time after my probation is up." Before Mitsuki could jump on that like she so obviously wanted to, Masaru reached out to rest his hand gently on Izuku's shoulder and flashed him a small smile. "We're happy to hear that you feel comfortable with Aizawa. Mitsuki was worried they weren't treating you well." His words were met with his wife's fist hitting the table, unable to stop herself it seemed from behind loud and over the top as usual. "Demon right I was. You've been through enough without those BS's adding on to it." The woman fumed. "I tried to call up to the school to talk to you and the DM and principal told me you didn't exist." The laugh that Izuku let out was light and almost a giggle and had every single Bakugo in the room staring at him strangely. He flashed a brilliant smile Mitsuki's way and waved his hand to try and dispel her confusion. I apologize, Andy. I asked him to respond that way just in case my mother caught wind of this somehow. Not to say that I thought you would tell her, of course. I just wanted to be extra cautious. The green-haired teen flashed another smile and reached for his tea again, seemingly happy that the principal had actually kept his end of the bargain. The hag's expression changed a little, then. Katsuki held his breath, debating if he should change the subject or just grab Izuku and run. Instead of exploding again, Mitsuki reached out to put her hand over Izuku's and making sure he was looking at her before she spoke. I won't tell her anything if you don't want me to. Did she hurt you? Do I need to kill her? Mitsuki's voice was serious and her expression didn't waver as Izuku laughed nervously. I mean it, Aizu. I might have known her since we were kids, but if she did something to harm a single hair on your head, I will not feel guilty. From where he was sitting, Katsuki could see the sheen of tears in Izuku's eyes and was 2 seconds away from loudly demanding his mother cut the crap when the teen gripped her hand back and shook his head vigorously. No. Auntie, she didn't hurt me on purpose. The teen huffed a little, blinking back tears and reaching up to rub at his eyes with the back of his hand. She wanted to lock me in my room for my safety and treated me like I was made of glass. I was never going to be able to be my own person with her. Katsuki could see his parents exchange looks before his father reached out to rub a hand over Izuku's shoulders lightly. Okay, Izuku, we understand. We won't say anything, promise. The man's voice was soft, but the looks exchanged between him and his mother were making some sort of danger sense blare in the back of Katsuki's brain. He didn't know, though, if it was just teenage embarrassment at whatever his parents were plotting or actual danger. If you want to come stay with us over breaks, or if you ever need somewhere to go because that school is too much, you're always welcome. Okay? Hell, even if Katsuki is being a pain in the butt. So teenage embarrassment over his parents being awful. At least his mother's words got a soft giggle out of the teen. Stop being embarrassing. I'm sure his new dad, Aizawa, will try and fight you if you adopt him before he can. Kaken. Several hours later found Izuku and Katsuki walking through the local mall, fingers interlaced and swinging between them lightly. Katsuki wasn't even sure if they had a destination in mind at this point because every few minutes Izuku was pulling him off into a different direction. He wasn't going to complain, though, because it was worth it to watch the other teen's face light up as he caught sight of something interesting. The blonde did note, however, that the green-haired teen was giving any kind of hero merch a wide berth. He couldn't say he blamed him, per se, considering what the other had told them of his past with heroes, but it was sad, almost. He would never say this to Izuku's face, but a part of him missed the nerds rambling about how cool heroes and their quirks were. Sure, he still rambled about quirks, but it was mostly classmates or upperclassmen he'd spotted in the halls. Maybe he could bait him into talking about present Mike and Aizawa? Katsuki was pulled out of his thoughts by Izuku tugging them in a new direction, towards a sporting goods store. I could probably find a decent knife in here. Shoyuta won't give me back mine for another week. The last part was whined and Katsuki couldn't help the snort that left him. You know, most kids complain that their parents take away their phone or something. You're complaining about getting your weaponry taken, nerd. His words, though, were softened by the fact that he was grinning at the other teen. Rude, Kaken. Weaponry is very teenager of me, I'll have you know. Izuku sniffed, practically lifting his nose in the air and drawing another laugh from the blonde. Well, Mr. Teenager, why don't we go get some food before we start shopping for weapons? I'd like to have a last meal before your dad kills me for letting you buy that stuff. Again, the other teen just rolled his eyes at him but stopped pulling him towards the store. Him stopping short caused Katsuki to bump into him, and before he could take a step back, Izuku turned a little and grabbed the front of his shirt, which left him in the position of Izuku pressed rather close to his front, grinning up at him and batting his eyelashes as he leaned against his chest. Katsuki was momentarily distracted, wondering if it was normal for his heart to try and beat itself out of his chest just from close proximity. Maybe he needed to see Recovery Girl when they got back? It would be so romantic if Kaken got it for me? His tone was teasing enough that Katsuki knew he wasn't serious, but it didn't stop the thought from sounding appealing. until he remembered why it was an awful, horrible idea. Ah, you're trying to get me killed by Aizawa now, I'm sure of it. Izuku threw his head back and laughed, taking a step away from Katsuki and grinning widely at him. Honestly, no, but my accounts they could find are kind of frozen right now, or I'd buy one myself. The teen shrugged, grin still on his lips as he swung their intertwined hands playfully. Katsuki's retort died on his tongue, though, as someone came from behind Izuku and draped an arm across his shoulders. His free hand started to come up to pop off some warning explosions before he registered what exactly he was seeing. Icy blue eyes met red, scars on the man's face stretching a little as he grinned at Katsuki. Izuku shifted a little and made a noise of confusion, attempting to pull away from the man, but he tightened his grip and leaned more heavily on the other teen's shoulders to keep him in place. I could buy them for you if you want, Izuku. I know the kind you prefer after all. Dabi drawled, gaze never leaving Katsuki. Izuku wondered, sometimes, what he'd done in a past life to deserve the awful luck he had. Of course, today of all days, Dabi decided to show himself. Today, of all days, the universe decided to send him a big middle finger in the form of the man he least wanted to see right now. In the middle of a mall where Izuku couldn't scream every obscenity he knew at the man and then quietly beat the sheet out of him. He could see the look on Katsuki's face, the rage starting to light up in those red eyes, and desperately wished he had a quirk to turn back time and avoid this interaction ever happening. Izuku knew deep in the bottom of his heart that this was going to dig up old trauma for the blonde, and he hated that this was his fault. If he'd had it his way, no one outside of Shoyuta and possibly Shudo would know about his connection to Dabi. Hell, after they'd left things, he hadn't thought the man would be willing to approach him again. The taller man's arm shifted, so he was pulling Izuku back against him, pulling him out of his thoughts as well. With a hiss, he elbowed the fire-quirked man in the stomach as hard as he could and slipped out of his grip. Dabi let out a grunt of pain and tried to reach out for him again, fingertips missing his hoodie by mere centimeters. What the actual F is wrong with you? Izuku hissed again, turning to face him as he purposely put himself between Katsuki and the League member. Finally facing the other, he could see the anger brewing in the man's eyes. As if he had anything to be angry about. The last time Izuku had seen him was right before he abandoned him for Shigaraki. The worst part of facing him, though, was watching the cogs turn in his brain. He could see his former friend and mentor putting pieces together as his gaze darted between Katsuki and Izuku. There was almost a grim satisfaction in Izuku's gut at the way Dabi's lips downturned for a brief moment. He hadn't even thought about Dabi when he'd agreed to this date, not even once. But now a little bit of satisfaction curled in his gut that he could inflict pain on the man even just a little. To show him a little of what he'd felt when the man walked out of his life to join the very person he hated most. Izuku hadn't done the exact same, of course, but he could enjoy his own petty version of that feeling. Behind him, he could hear Katsuki shifting anxiously as the silent stare down between him and Dabi stretched on. This was going to be awful to explain to him later. If he even got a chance to explain. Katsuki had his own issues with Dabi, Izuku knew, and him having the kind of connection he did to the man was not going to go over well. He could already see the fight that was going to come after this. If Katsuki didn't just straight up refuse to speak to him, he wouldn't blame him if that was the road he decided to take. You know, I never really took you as the type to sink this low, Aizu. Dabi finally broke the silence, stance relaxing a little as he shoved his hands into his pockets and flashed Izuku a smile that made a shiver run up his spine. It was petty and way too relaxed for his liking. I mean, playing the sweet innocent victim card is a bit degrading, isn't it? I thought I taught you to have some self-respect. Behind him, Katsuki made a noise of confusion and stepped forward enough that Izuku could see him out of the corner of his eye. One of his hands reached out to wrap around Izuku's wrist, trying to get his attention. Aizu? The blonde repeated, tone unreadable as he stared hard at him. Izuku did his best not to meet his eye, instead focusing on the villain in front of them. I'm assuming that's what you're doing, right? When things got scary after Kamino, you ran to your precious Kaken and weaseled your way into his good graces? You've always been a bit conniving, but this takes the cake. The hand on his wrist quickly turned into Katsuki holding Izuku back. The green-haired teen's lips curled back in a snarl as he reached out to attempt to wipe the man's smirk off of his face with his fist. "How dare you!" he snarled, fighting against Katsuki's hold on him for a moment longer before deciding he wasn't going to be allowed to assault the man in front of him for the moment. "You know DMN well that I can protect myself. As if you even care since you've made so many new friends." Dabi didn't even flinch as the words were spat at him, though. His smile widened into a smirk and he tilted his head a little, gaze flickering over to Katsuki again. "Aizu, come on. I offered for you to come with me. Shigaraki even said he'd behave. It's not my fault you decided splitting would be better than joining with me." The words were said with a shrug, but Izuku knew better. Knew what game the man was playing. He could feel Katsuki's eyes boring into the side of his face before his gaze flickered away to Dabi once more. Izuku grit his teeth against the scream of frustration that built up in his chest. All he'd wanted was one good day. Just one. Wasn't he owed at least one moment of peace? "Is this really the game you want to play?" Izuku hissed, hands curling into fists at his side as he glared at him. "Do remember how much I know. Lots of things that could not slip. You know, since I'm so conniving and all." A flash of uncertainty crossed his face and his gaze flickered around to the small crowd that was beginning to gather around them. Blue eyes flickered back to Izuku, sneer pulling at his lips as he pulled his hands out of his pockets and held them up in mock surrender. "Point made. Have fun on the rest of your date, Aizu." Before Izuku could retaliate for that comment, he turned around and disappeared into the crowd. As much as he wanted to follow him and find out what the actual F that was about, he couldn't. Not when his attention was pulled back to the one audience member to this disaster that mattered with a small tug to his wrist. Growling a little under his breath, he twisted his wrist and hand until he was holding the blonde's hand firmly and began pulling him in the opposite direction that Dabi had fled. "Come on, we need to go." The last thing Izuku or Katsuki needed was to get caught having some sort of altercation in the mall with a villain. Katsuki didn't have his provisional license yet and Izuku would be taken back into custody before even Nizu would be able to save him. Izuku pulled Katsuki through the crowd and towards the entrance of the mall quickly, stomach rolling uncomfortably when he looked back to catch sight of the guarded look in the blondes. It wasn't until they were out of the mall and a few streets away that Izuku stopped pulling on the other teen, ducking into an alleyway before finally stopping. In a fit of frustration, Izuku kicked a nearby trash can over and finally let go of Katsuki's hand. Now free, his hands made their way into his own hair as he tugged at it and turned to kick at the wall of the alley. "Next time I see that BSGD, I'm pulling staples out of his stupid, smug face. What right does he have to say shit like that?" He ranted, finally turning and slumping against the wall a little. Katsuki stood a few feet away from him, expression unreadable and posture closed off. The silence between them stretched on and on, both of them watching each other for a sign or a scrap of what the other was thinking. "Really, nerd? Dabi?" "Of all people," Katsuki finally said, shoving his hands in his pockets and slumping against the wall opposite to Izuku. Everything in his posture screamed defensive and closed off. Izuku pushed himself off of his wall and took a few hesitant steps towards the blonde, pausing to see if he was welcomed in the other's space at the moment. There was no indication that he wasn't allowed, so he stepped forward again. He wasn't always this bad. He started, unable to meet Katsuki's eyes. One of his hands came up to rub at his arm, shrugging a little. The snort the other teen let out drew a small chuckle from him, hand coming up to rub at the back of his neck. "Izuku, he's a villain." At his words, Izuku finally met Katsuki's gaze again. The blonde's gaze was angry and Izuku met it with anger of his own. "So am I, you know." Izuku bit the words out through clenched teeth, frustration welling up in him again. "He saved my life. He pulled me out of that river and then spent a lot of time and energy keeping me alive afterwards." Katsuki dropped his gaze, crossing his arms over his chest as his jaw clenched and unclenched. He obviously couldn't argue against that and Izuku hadn't wanted to throw that particular bit of information at him, just yet, DMN it. "I'm not saying he's a good person. Hell, I don't like him all that much at the moment. But at the end of the day, I can't just pretend like I don't owe him my DMN life. The blonde looked up once more, locking Izuku's gaze to his own as he obviously mulled over whatever question was on his mind. You split with him when he joined the league? Yes. I can't stand Shigaraki. What you saw in the bar that night was a mild disagreement in the grand scheme of how much we don't get along. Right. So you and Stapleface were dating before he joined up with Krusty? Izuku opened and closed his mouth a few times before looking away, unsure how to answer. He lifted his shoulder in a small shrug and let his hand make a so-so gesture. Kinda? We were never physical or anything like that, but he's definitely not a brother or father figure. Izuku didn't think in a million years he'd ever be able to fully explain the complicated nature of his and Dabi's relationship. Dabi, up until recently, had been the one person that Izuku felt he could be himself around without judgment. He'd been the only person on the planet that Izuku never had to doubt would be in his corner or not. Or so he'd thought. Sheet, as usual, went to hell in a handbasket when Shigaraki got involved. Do you love him? Izuku's head shot up at the question, meeting Katsuki's gaze again. He could see the insecurity, then, and the anger that was simmering under the surface. Stepping closer to him, he carefully watched the other's face as he slid his fingertips over his arm. When the blonde didn't pull away, he put a little more pressure, palms sliding up and down his arm comfortingly as he stepped further into his space. For a few long moments he didn't say anything, just stood in Katsuki's space and gently ran his hand up and down his arm. Slowly, the anger seemed to seep from the blonde's gaze and was replaced by bone-deep worry and a stormy expression rather than rage. Yes, I do. He kept his voice soft, gaze locked with Katsuki's as he tried to convey how serious he was about this. He needed Katsuki to understand where he was coming from here. I know it sounds weird, but yes. If he were in trouble right now, despite how angry I am with him, I'd call in as many favors as I needed to and do some very morally and legally questionable things to make sure at the end of the day he was alive and able to be an a-hole. Izuku drew in a deep breath to calm his nerves, heart beating painfully at his ribcage as he slowly traced his hands up Katsuki's arms and shoulders until he was cupping the blonde-haired boy's face between his hands. His expression and gaze was still stormy, but it softened a little as Izuku let his thumb sweep over his cheek lightly. I need you to understand, Kaken, that yes, I would do all of that for him if you were in the same position, or if anyone tried to harm you, I would do so much more. Izuku's voice was firm as he leaned further into Katsuki's space and prayed that the other could feel his sincerity right now. I would rip the world apart atom by atom for you. There's no force on earth that would be able to stop me from doing whatever I needed to do to make sure you're okay. There was a long moment where neither of them said anything, just watched each other carefully and soaked up the proximity of the other. Izuku was confident that his message got across, but outside of that he couldn't be sure. He was sure that Katsuki could feel his heart beating rapidly and feel the way his hands shook a little against his face as he tried not to rush the other teen. Finally, Katsuki reached up to take Izuku's hand from his face so he could tangle their fingers together. Some of the tension bled out of him, enough for Izuku to know that the other wasn't fully happy with the situation, but he was no longer ready to fight. Way to be intense, nerd. The blonde mumbled, pulling Izuku closer until he could tuck his head under his chin and wrap his free arm around him. This was not how I pictured tonight going, by the way. Yeah, I figured. Izuku laughed quietly, relaxing against Katsuki and soaking up every bit of attention he was giving him. Later, they would part and head back to the school to deal with telling Shoyudo what had happened. But that was later, and Izuku was going to enjoy every bit of warmth he could get. Time ticked by slowly as they stood in the alley, Katsuki leaning back against the wall and holding Izuku to his chest carefully. The blonde stared vacantly at the wall across from him, trying to get his thoughts in some semblance of order. Everything was just so jumbled. Katsuki didn't know what emotions were swirling around in his chest at the moment, all too mixed together at the moment for him to really untangle them. Part of him wanted to rage and blow up everything within a 50-foot radius. The quieter part of him just wanted to curl up somewhere and try to forget that today had even happened. Everything had been going so well. His parents hadn't completely embarrassed him when he'd brought Izuku home, and the date had been going so well up until Dabi, of all people, had a history with the nerd. Even if he didn't admit it to anyone else, Katsuki still had nightmares about the scared BSTRD, and that night at the training camp could sometimes still feel the man's hand wrapped around the back of his neck as he was pulled into that portal. But that was, now, the man who kept Izuku alive. That man was now the person he owed for having the chance to apologize to Izuku. For keeping him alive when no one was there or aware that he was in danger. That was now, also, someone so dear to Izuku that even as mad as the green-haired teen was, he still admitted to caring for him? How was Katsuki supposed to reconcile any of this? It left his mind spinning and his chest tight. His therapist was going to have a field day with the sheet when he finally got in to see her. Katsuki was pulled out of his swirling and circling thoughts as Izuku shifted in his hold a little, nuzzling his face into his shirt as if he could read Katsuki's mind. He'd certainly known that he wouldn't react well to this information, which was why he'd kept it a secret. How many more secrets was the green-haired teen keeping from him? How many more surprises was he due for? Did he even want to know, really? Before he could get lost in his thoughts again, the smaller teen was pulling back a little to peek up at his face. He couldn't be sure what the other was seeing, but it likely wasn't good nor what he was looking for if the way he bit his lip and pulled away a little more was anything to go by. Kaken, I'm sorry. I really am. Sorry that it happened like this or that I found out at all. The words slipped out of his mouth before he could stop them, and for a brief moment he felt bad. Izuku's expression closed off and he stepped away from Katsuki altogether, letting go of his hand and turning his face away. What do you want me to say, Kaken? No, I didn't ever think it would be relevant information. The teen mumbled, crossing his arms over his chest and shifting uncomfortably. Relevant information? You didn't think the fact that you have connections to the League and a wanted criminal isn't relevant information? Katsuki exploded finally, pushing away from the wall he was leaned against to step back into Izuku's space. Didn't think that your ex-boyfriend is part of the League and might hold a grudge was relevant information? If you want a list of every single wanted criminal I have connections to, we're going to be here a very long time, Kaken. Izuku ground out, finally looking up at Katsuki. He uncrossed his arms from his chest and pushed on Katsuki's chest with a growl. I am a wanted criminal. I've done so much shit that I can't ever tell you that it could fill 10 more notebooks than I already have. I'm sorry that I'm not the sweet innocent Deku I was when I tried to kill myself. Katsuki jerked like he'd been slapped and watched as Izuku turned away from him, stalking angrily back to the other side of the alley and curled in on himself. Katsuki's own shoulders dropped as he took a deep breath and dragged a hand through his hair. How had today turned out so awful? All he'd wanted to do was show Izuku he cared and wanted to make this work. Shaking himself out of his thoughts, he approached the smaller teen once more. He carefully laid a hand on Izuku's shoulder and gently pulled until he was facing him again. Katsuki cursed himself as he noticed the tears building in the other's eyes. I don't want you to be that person, Izuku, I just... With a frustrated huff, he cut himself off and glanced away, trying to find the words to convey the swirling mass of emotions in his chest. I was caught off guard, tonight, and I am trying so hard to understand who you are now. Izuku swiped at his face with the sleeve of his hoodie before turning to face Katsuki again fully. He hated how small and closed off he was, angry with himself that he caused this. Angry with Dabi for being BSTRD enough to cause this entire situation. A little angry with Izuku as well for not telling him, damn it. Kaken, you have to understand, there are some things that I'm never going to be able to tell you about. Not because I don't want to, but because they could put you in more danger than I ever want to be the cause of, Izuku said after a moment, looking up at him with wide eyes that practically begged him to understand, to listen. Then just tell me what you can. Just don't shut me out because you're scared of my reaction. Katsuki ground out after a moment, turning his face away and dragging a hand through his hair again. Just because I don't like it doesn't mean I'm going to abandon you over it. When he glanced back at the other, he could see Izuku searching his face for something. Whatever he was looking for he seemed to find because in the next moment he was stepping back into Katsuki's space. The blonde held his breath for a second before letting it out slowly as the other simply reached out to tangle their fingers together gently. "I can do that," Izuku said quietly, flashing him a small smile. "Just not right this second? I'm kinda exhausted from this revelation." Katsuki rolled his eyes and pulled the other in closer, dropping a kiss to his hair gently before pulling back to nod. "Yes, same. Let's get back to the dorms before Aizawa starts hunting us down, eh?" Izuku stepped into the classroom, backpack slung over his shoulder, and paused for a second to take in the scene in front of him. All Might was once again standing near the podium, and once again, the sight made him want to turn around and flee. Seeing All Might standing near the podium was an altogether unpleasant experience after last time, and the class seemed to agree. Everyone was already in their seats, their gazes bouncing nervously between Izuku and the former hero once they realized he had arrived. Several of the class were glaring at the man, and he was obviously trying not to show how uncomfortable he was at the hostility lingering in the air, but the tense line of his shoulders told everyone who knew to look for it all they needed to know. Izuku almost wanted to giggle a little at the sight of one of the most formidable heroes in history squirming as 19 teenagers glared daggers at him. Hiding his smile, he stepped up to the podium and set down the stack of papers he'd brought with him. From the corner of his eye, he could see Shoyuta wrapped up in his sleeping bag, looking to the untrained eye like he was napping. The tension in his shoulders eased and Izuku turned his head to flash the man a small smile. It appeared no one was eager to have a repeat performance from the former #1 hero. Looking back out over the class, Izuku met Katsuki's intense gaze and smiled, giving a small wave before turning his attention back to the business at hand. This wasn't his first time leading the lesson, but it was by far the most important. It was going to be the ultimate test of if his plan was successful or not. He was fairly sure he'd left enough breadcrumbs for the class to follow, but one could never be 100% sure what information others retained. Katsuki and Shoyuta were sure to put 2 and 2 together immediately, but the others? Well, it was now or never, he supposed. All Might was staring at him with barely concealed contempt as he moved around the podium and started passing out the papers. He'd already voiced his displeasure at taking a back seat for this lesson to Shoyuta and gotten told to deal with it or talk to Nizu. Rightfully, it seemed, All Might was hesitant to cross the rat principle more than once. So he kept his mouth shut and moved to sit behind the podium. Izuku, ignoring the daggers the man was glaring at his back, finished passing the papers out and flashed the class a smile. Most of them smiled back, Mina and Kaminari shooting him very obvious thumbs up that he couldn't help but grin at. "Alright, so today we're doing a group discussion kind of thing. I know you've already had your unit on procedures and protocol, but with the provisional license exam coming up, we thought it'd be best to go over it again, briefly," he said brightly, eyes roving over the class as they got their papers and cracked open their notebooks. He could see several of them wrinkling their noses as they stared at the papers and internally laughed to himself. This, out of all of the breadcrumbs, was going to be the most fun to execute. Turning, he took the last 2 remaining papers and handed one each to the other teachers in the room. Shoyuta raised a brow at him as he leaned over the desk and waved the paper in his face but silently took it, seeming to catch on to the fact that Izuku was up to something. All Might, on the other hand, was as blissfully unaware as usual and took the paper from Izuku with a small grunt. With a brilliant smile, Izuku turned back to the class, noting a couple more disgusted faces in the crowd now that most of them had the time to skim the paper a little. "So, this is a real-life scenario. This happened nearby a couple of years ago, so I thought it'd be perfect to use as an example. We're going to discuss what this hero did right, what they did wrong, and discuss how to avoid the mistakes that were made here. Not so bad, right?" He bounced a little on the ball of his feet as he said this, scanning the faces in front of him again. Behind him, he could hear the paper in All Might's grip crinkling and probably tearing. He didn't turn around, but he could almost picture the look on the man's face as he realized exactly what incident was on the paper held by each and every one of his students. "Midoriya, this is highly inappropriate. We shouldn't be tearing down other heroes like this." All Might's voice was firm, but Izuku could hear the quietest note of panic buried deep in his tone. He turned on his heel a little to flash the toothiest grin he could manage at the man, pinning him in place with a stare that could rival Shuta's level of unimpressed. He let the man squirm for a moment before gesturing with his hands and a shrug. Niza disagrees, sir. Real-life scenarios are invaluable for our students, so he personally approved this lesson plan for today. He said brightly before turning his back on the man once more. He let his gaze flicker briefly up to the camera in the corner of the room, winking at it before he refocused back to the class. For the moment he'd let the man stew in the panic of exactly how much Nizu possibly knew about this scenario. Nothing, so far, but he was fairly sure the principal would have the whole picture soon enough. Especially with how nervous the former number one was acting right now. By now, most of the class had read the scenario and Izuku was more than a little thrilled to see the way they were looking down at their papers. Most of them were scribbling notes down and others were just staring at the paper like it had offended them. Ida was making chopping motions to himself while Todoroki looked like he was contemplating setting it on fire. However, Izuku's eyes were drawn to Katsuki and the scowl that was etched into his face. There was no way that the blonde didn't recognize the description of the villain in this scenario. Izuku knew he'd put at least some of the pieces together by the way the edges of the paper were smoking in his hands. So, who wants to tell me the first thing they noticed that was incorrect in this scenario? Izuku asked, clapping his hands together and scanning the crowd of students. Hagakure seemed to vibrate in her seat, uniform floating up like she was standing up in the desk and waving her arm violently to get Izuku's attention. Smiling a little to himself, he motioned for her to go first. The victim was unconscious for several minutes with a substance in their lungs that had been through God's only know where, and the hero didn't call for medical immediately. In fact, I don't think they called for medical or police once during this entire takedown. She said, sitting back down and shaking the paper at him. Obviously, he couldn't see her face, but from her tone of voice she was frowning. There were murmurs of agreement throughout the class, and Izuku motioned for Ida to speak as his hand shot up next, anticipating that the floor was now open for discussion. Standing up, Ida adjusted his glasses and glanced back down at his notes with a frown. The biggest mistake this hero made was not calling in for the police and medical once the villain was captured. Plastic bottles are obviously not the best capture method, and there was no guarantee that they would hold. This entire mess could have been avoided had they stayed on scene like protocol dictates. The teen adjusted his glasses again, almost outright scowling now as he seemed to think on it more. It was very irresponsible of this hero, and I would hope he was reprimanded for the damage done when the villain escaped. Tokoyami waited till Ida had sat back down before speaking, giving Izuku searching glances every few seconds as he glanced between him and the paper in front of him. The victim shouldn't have grabbed hold of the hero, yes, but the fact that the hero left what is described to be a minor on a rooftop with no way down is concerning in itself. Especially since they had not seen a medical professional yet. Discussion rose around the room, but Izuku's gaze was drawn back to Katsuki, finding the red of his gaze boring into him once more. A muscle jumped in his jaw as he clenched and unclenched it as if physically forcing himself not to start demanding answers right that moment. Izuku spared a moment to feel a little proud of him before turning his attention back towards the rest of the but any kind of fluid in the lungs is a problem, ribbit. Tsu was explaining to Kirishima, who looked a little lost. I've heard of people drowning on dry land because they didn't go see a doctor after inhaling water. Izuku tried to school his expression to a mildly interested one, but he could tell that his face dropped a little, and he was sure his already pale complexion grew a few shades lighter. The bacteria in his lungs just from the sludge villain had been bad, but the water he'd been pulled from hadn't helped matters. Katsuki must have heard the statement as well as saw the way Izuku reacted at the mention of drowning, because his handle on his temper slipped and his hands slammed against the desk loudly. Every eye turned his way, but he didn't seem to notice nor care at the moment. You were attacked first that day, he said without preamble, shaking the paper in his hands in Izuku's direction. He didn't wait for Izuku to confirm or deny the statement, instead pressing on as rage filled his gaze. And whoever this piece of shit hero is told you that quirkless kids can't be heroes. Behind Izuku, he could hear both pro-heroes moving from their positions as silence fell over the students at Katsuki's declaration. Young Bakugo, calm yourself. This is no way for a hero student to act over a small thing like this. All might boomed from behind Izuku. Katsuki missed the way the green-haired teen flinched as he tore his gaze away for a brief moment to pin the former symbol of peace with a glare. "Shut it, old man, you obviously don't know sheet." The blonde snarled, shaking the paper again before his gaze swung back to Izuku. "Whoever this piece of sheet is, he's part of the reason you jumped off that bridge, and I'm going to tear his spine out of his mouth." "Bakugo!" Shuda's voice was reprimanding, but it did nothing to cool the simmering rage in the blonde's eyes. If anything, the fire grew hotter and Izuku found himself rooted in place. Of all of the outcomes he'd planned for, this one was pretty far down on the list of what Izuku had expected to happen today. Sure, Katsuki would be upset, but not this upset. Hell, he'd half expected the blonde to be angry at him for letting the villain get away and come after him. He wouldn't blame him, honestly. The feeling of suffocating on something you can't expel was a vivid part of his own nightmares for a long time after the incident. "Oh, it." Katsuki growled, leaning over his desk again to slam the fist holding the paper down onto it. Izuku's gaze skipped away from Katsuki nervously, taking in the faces of the class for a moment while he tried to figure out how to answer. He couldn't outright say it was the man standing almost directly behind him, now. No, that would still be leaving himself too open for retaliation and the accusation of slander. Unless All Might incriminated himself, now, there was no way Izuku was going to be able to answer that question. Even if every student in the room was staring at him, seemingly wanting the same answer. Kirishima and Ito were out of their seats, hovering anxiously as if waiting to have to keep the peace. Shuji and Ojiro were still in their seats, but they were eyeing Katsuki warily in case they needed to jump in and help restrain him, if needed. The only person not looking at Katsuki or Izuku was Todoroki. His mismatched eyes were trained on All Might. His expression was as blank and unreadable as ever, but there was something in his eyes that made Izuku's stomach clench uncomfortably. Why were the Todoroki siblings always the one thing to either save or destroy him, anymore? The moment those mismatched eyes flickered over to him, Izuku knew everything was about to blow up. In possibly the best way. Or worst. One could never tell the direction a Todoroki-shaped bomb was going to go off, honestly. Use your brain, Bakugo. Who in the pro-hero scene can use one punch to end a fight? His voice was monotone as usual, but there was a fire behind his eyes as his gaze landed on the former #1 hero once more. I can only think of one, and if I'm not mistaken, he used the same attack against the same villain later on that day. The silence that overtook the room was even worse than the first time, and Izuku hesitated to peek at Katsuki's expression. When he did, though, all he saw there was bone-deep shock. Even the fires of the blonde's anger couldn't help but take a back seat to the revelation that his hero wasn't what he thought he was. For a second time, the entire class had to face that fact. A hand fell on his shoulder and Izuku nearly jumped out of his skin. His gaze skittered backwards to meet Shuda's, the man's eyes dark and stormy as he seemed to search Izuku's gaze for whatever answer he was looking for. He didn't seem happy with whatever he found if the way his grip tightened was anything to go by. Seconds seemed to tick by as everyone in the room digested the information that had just been dumped at their feet. It wasn't an easy pill to swallow that someone they all admired was the cause of the downfall, almost literally, of someone else they admired. Especially when All Might stood on such a high pedestal. The first incident in the classroom had brought him an inch or two closer, mind you, but this was damn near knocking him off of it for most of them. Izuku turned his head a little to sneak a peek at the #1 hero and found him glaring at him with all his might. The rational part of his brain told him that the man wouldn't attempt anything against him in front of the entire class, especially after what had happened the last time, but the other part of his brain screamed danger. And well, Izuku hadn't survived as long as he had without listening to the danger part of his brain. Very carefully he ducked out of Shuda's grasp and began to back away, towards the door. The class would have questions, but those could wait until later. Away from the hateful gaze of someone who looked like they'd really like to strangle him right this moment. Unfortunately, for him, his movement seemed to break whatever spell had fallen over the class and the entire room erupted into noise. Vaguely, he could hear Katsuki's explosions over the yelling, but he was more focused on trying to make a break for the door than hearing what anyone was saying. Right as his fingertips brushed the edge of the door, a massive hand grabbed his hoodie. He had a brief moment to wonder what kind of strength the skeleton-like man managed to keep before he was pinned against the door by the former number 1 hero. The man's free hand came up to wrap around his throat, expression murderous as he leaned in to pin the teenager in place. "I won't let you corrupt these children against me further." The blonde man growled out, hand tightening around Izuku's throat as he easily ignored the teenager's hand clawing at his wrist. "This is the last time you twist the truth like this. I'll make sure of it." Struggling against him, Izuku not for the first time wished he had his knives on him. The teen attempted to lift his knee up to put pressure on the man's injured side, hoping to get him to back off, but the man instead shifted out of his reach. The move did give him a little bit of space as the pressure to his throat lessened enough for him to get a good breath in. "Not twisting the truth," he ground out, glaring up at the man as he aimed a kick at the man's left side again. It gave him a little more room and the man's grip loosened again. He was close to freeing himself when the volume in the classroom rose once more, explosions drowning out the yelling as they got closer. Katsuki didn't get a chance to tackle the former pro, however, before a familiar capture weapon was wrapping around the tall blonde man and pulling him away from Izuku. Katsuki skid to a stop next to Izuku as Shoyuta hauled all might backwards, struggling a little as the man fought against him. Izuku could feel calloused hands pulling at his hoodie and ghosting at the skin of his neck, but he couldn't look at the other teen, eyes still glued to where Shoyuta was restraining the tall blonde. "You can't run from the truth, Toshinori. You made your bed, now lay in it." Izuku pushed as much of his anger into his voice as he could muster, pulling himself to his full height and glaring at the man. "It's not my fault you decided to be a shitty excuse for a hero in the end." The man stopped struggling for a brief moment, enough that Izuku could finally hazard to look up at Shoyuta and meet his eyes once again. He couldn't read the emotion in them and forced himself to look away. Unfortunately, the only other safe place to look was at Katsuki. Katsuki was still hovering at his side, hand extended like he was debating pushing Izuku behind him and out of sight of the man wrapped up in Shuta's capture weapon. Something in Izuku's chest broke a little at the sight and the enormity of the entire situation finally crashed down on him. Everyone knew what happened that day. They all knew everything now. Despite the fact that this was what he'd wanted, the enormity of everything pushed down on him and made his chest tight and his breathing stutter. Suddenly the walls of the classroom began to close in on him, and he needed to go. The traitorous part of his brain whispered that everyone was going to know how weak he was now. Without a word, he turned on his heel and fled from the classroom. Once Izuku left the room, things happened very quickly. Nizu himself entered the room not 5 minutes later, followed by Midnight and Cementos. It seemed like they'd already been briefed on the situation as Midnight quickly knocked All Might out and he was taken from the classroom by the two heroes. Presumably to Nizu's office, though no one caught the details of what exactly was happening there. Katsuki barely heard Nizu trying to calm Aizawa down over the sound of his own heartbeat in his ears. He found himself sitting on the floor of the classroom, Shiro and Kirishima on either side of him. In his peripheral he could see Ida and Yaoyorozu herding the class away from where he was seated and back towards their desks. Very little of what they were saying was registering to him, though, so he turned his head so he could watch the principal and their teacher. The rat was standing on the podium speaking to the man who looked absolutely wrecked. If Katsuki had any energy left, he'd be surprised at the level of emotion the usually stoic hero was showing. Even with his addled brain, Katsuki could see the man's hands shaking and the way one of his hands was still wrapped tightly around his capture weapon. "He's left the campus already." Nizu's voice drifted over to him and the blonde couldn't help but shoot up from his sitting position to insert himself into the conversation. "He left." The rat's gaze bore into Katsuki for a moment like he was trying to see into his brain or something before he shifted to face the teen, posture calm and collected. "Yes, he was seen on cameras leaving campus just after I arrived on scene." "Not to worry, young Bakugo. This is completely expected." Nizu's words seemed to pull something out of Aizawa because the man dragged a hand through his hair and looked like he wanted to strangle the principal. "Expected? None of this was expected." The man grit out, eyes a little wild at the edges and posture tense. "Well, not all of it, no. I certainly wasn't expecting the former number 1 hero to attempt to strangle a minor. However, Izuku running away when things got a little too much for him was something I was expecting. Nizu clapped his paws together and motioned for Aizawa to come closer. I expected it to be much sooner than this, but not to worry. His phone has a tracker in it and he has things here he clearly cares about. He'll return once he is ready. The irritation Katsuki felt was mirrored in Aizawa's face as he stepped closer and let the rat climb up onto his shoulders. He turned his attention to Katsuki once more and flashed him a smile, giving a small wave of his paw. We will handle this, don't you worry. Just focus on helping your friends wrap their minds around this before Izuku comes back. He will need support, don't you think? As much as he didn't want to admit it, that really was all he could do in this situation. Sure, he could leave school grounds to go try and hunt Izuku down, but even he had to admit that he had no idea where the green-haired teen would be headed. He'd managed to survive for almost 3 years without anyone being even the slightest bit aware he was alive. What hope did Katsuki have in tracking him down if he didn't want to be found? Nodding, he turned to go back to where Shiro and Kirishima were hovering nervously but paused as Aizawa turned to leave. The man saw his pause and turned his gaze to him, questioning and dull. Katsuki's hands curled into fists at his sides and he grit his teeth against the swell of rage still burning in his chest. Don't let the BSD get away with this. Aizawa's gaze sharpened and for the first time Katsuki could see the rage simmering just under the surface reflected back at him. The man didn't say anything, instead giving a sharp nod and turning on his heel. As much as Katsuki wanted to be able to do something, it was in the best hands it could be in. Aizawa had proven over and over that he'd do what it took to protect their class. There wasn't a doubt in his mind that had this scenario happen to one of them, he'd still be furious and on a warpath. But Katsuki also wasn't stupid. No one who watched the hero and Izuku interact could miss the fact that the man was probably working on adoption papers in his free time. With that thought in mind, Katsuki turned back to where his friends were hovering and gave them a short nod of his own. Kirishima flashed him a small smile and patted him on the back as he passed, both of them turning to follow him back to the rest of the class. Katsuki pushed past Ida and Yaoyorozu carefully and made his way to the closest desk, Ojiro blinking at him with uncertainty as he paused in front of him. The blonde ignored him and grabbed the paper that had started all of this mess off of his desk, frowning down at the words as his mind raced. Surely all of this hadn't happened in one day, right? Baku bro, you okay? Kirishima asked, pulling Katsuki out of his thoughts. His eyes scanned the class before dropping down to the paper in his hand. Kirishima followed his gaze and frowned, stepping closer to put his hand on the blonde's shoulder gently. You were attacked by that same villain, weren't you? 2 years ago Katsuki would have attempted to blow the redhead's face off for even mentioning the incident. Now, though, he just nodded numbly and kept his eyes on the paper. The class had the good sense to not push the issue, a hushed kind of murmur filling the room and rolling past Katsuki without touching him. The paper crumpled in his hand as his fist closed, teeth grit against the rage just beneath the surface of his skin. All of this happened because that BSTRD couldn't be bothered to do his job correctly. Katsuki spit the words out as his free hand flexed at his side. He longed to be able to blow up something more satisfying than this stupid paper. Nothing was going to be okay until he could either punch All Might in the face himself or Izuku came back and they could all see for themselves that he was okay. Whichever came first. The loudest noise in Nizu's office was the sound of All Might's breathing, once he came to. He was sat in a chair in front of the principal's desk, not restrained but smart enough to not to move from the spot he'd woken up in. Midnight leaned against the wall behind him, examining her nails and every now and then glancing between Nizu and Shoyuta. The principal sat at his desk, humming to himself as typed something on his computer. Shoyuta leaned against Nizu's desk, arms crossed over his chest and his gaze never wavering from the former #1 hero. His quirk wasn't activated yet, but the tension in his entire body told anyone who looked at him how eager he was for the blonde man to attempt anything he didn't like. The silence was finally broken as Nizu leaned back from his computer and pushed his chair back enough that he could walk across the surface of his desk and stand almost level with Shoyuta. The rat clapped his hands as if trying to get their attention, though only All Might actually looked at him. Alrighty, then, time to address the rather large elephant in the room. All Might, you are hereby stripped of your position. I can't fire out outright, of course, since the commission has been sniffing ever closer to my business lately. However, you will no longer be teaching Class 1A and will instead be taking on a teaching assistant position to Vlad King of 1B. Should he have any complaints regarding your behavior, I will personally release the footage of you strangling a minor to the media. Nizu's gaze was sharp as he stared down the former number 1 hero, hands clasped behind his back. The smile that curved his lips was as close to feral as Shoyuta had ever seen it, and even if it wasn't completely the outcome that he wanted nor the vengeance he felt was deserved, it was good enough for the time being. If things weren't so tumultuous in our society right now because of your retirement, I would have skipped this conversation altogether, but with things the way they are, we can't afford to give Shigaraki and all for one's remaining minions any more ammunition. The former number 1 hero's mouth hung open slightly, brows furrowing in a way that was all too familiar to Shoyuta. All Might sat up in his chair further, trying to straighten to his full height despite the little bit of blood leaking from the corner of his mouth. You are going to take the word of a villain over mine. This is absolutely absurd. I have done nothing wrong. The man thundered, attempting to push himself out of his seat. He didn't get far, Midnight coming up behind him and placing a hand on his shoulder. I would sit down if I were you. We wouldn't want to have to tie you down, would we? Her voice was sweet, but Shoyuta could hear the underlying threat in her tone. Shoyuta pushed off of the desk and advanced into the former hero's space, lip curling into a snarl as his hand came up to grasp his capture weapon. The only reason we're not turning you over to the police is that so much time has passed and collecting evidence is impossible now. Shoyuta growled the words out, putting himself right up in the man's face. You were grossly negligent in caring for a victim on scene, cruel in crushing said already traumatized victim's dream, and then left said minor alone afterwards. The raven-haired hero reached out to grab 2 fistfuls of All Might's shirt and pulled him closer, making sure they were face to face and the blond man couldn't look away from him. The rage that had been simmering under the surface now flowing freely. He wanted this man to understand exactly what he'd done. Wanted to see him pay for every single stupid mistake he'd made that day that led his son to believing he was ultimately so worthless he didn't deserve to live. That child, then, decided to throw himself off a bridge because you couldn't be bothered to prioritize the victim and the rescue. A hero is supposed to protect All Might, but you were almost the direct cause of his death. You are the reason he became a villain in the first demon place, so stop using that as an excuse to put him down further. With every word the color drained from the former number 1 hero's face. As satisfying as it wasn't enough in Shuta's book. If he had his way, he'd burn the man's entire legacy to the ground. I didn't know. At All Might's words, Shoyuta threw the man the most disgusted look he could manage before letting go of him and stalking back towards Nizu's desk. The rat watched him with an unreadable expression before turning his attention back to All Might. Ignorance is no excuse. This matter is far from settled, but we need young Izuku for any further action, so you are free to go for the moment. Though, I do advise that you stay on campus. You signed a contract that would have consequences if you tried to break it and flee from your actions at this juncture. The sun had barely set when Izuku slipped through the door of the apartment safehouse, closing it softly behind him in an effort not to alert the neighbors of his presence. In this area of the city, everyone tended to mind their own business, but he couldn't take any chances. With a sigh, he rested his forehead against the wood of the door and finally let the tension from his shoulders drop. The encounter with All Might had left him wrung out and anxious all at the same time. He knew he probably should have stayed and dealt with the inevitable fallout, but he couldn't handle it right this moment. All he wanted to do was curl up in bed and sleep until the whole experience was a bad memory that he could repress for the rest of his life. If he was honest with himself, he probably wasn't going to leave this hidey hole until he was able to pull himself into the mindset of being able to cover the ring of bruises around his throat. It was bad enough that Katsuki had seen as it was. He wasn't protecting All Might. He wasn't. He was protecting Shoyuta and Hizashi. If they saw him like this, they'd go to jail for murder, and he wasn't going to ruin their lives like that. Well, never expected to see you here, Short Stack. Izuku's entire body tensed at once as the familiar voice sounded from behind him. For a moment, he wondered if maybe the gods hated him. They sure were doing their damnedest to ruin his life all at once. Several moments ticked by before he was able to turn his head enough to peek at the man standing behind him. Dabi looked the same as ever, cocky smirk in place, and his entire posture slouched as he leaned against the doorframe of the kitchen. "I didn't think you'd be here either, too busy playing with your new friends." Izuku couldn't put heat into his words, all the fight leaving him as he turned to lean his back against the front door. "I needed a place to crash, and this was the closest safe house I could remember." While Dabi's posture was relaxed, his eyes told a different story. They were cold and maybe a little angry. The sight of them made Izuku's stomach churn. What right did the fire user have to be angry with him? He was the one who'd abandoned him, not the other way around. The longer the silence stretched between them, the hotter his anger grew, scalding him from the inside out. He didn't deserve the silent treatment. He didn't deserve to be treated like a piece of gum underneath someone's shoe. He didn't deserve any of this. Unable to stand the silence and judgmental stare any longer, Izuku dropped his head back against the door and snarled to himself. His hood fell from his head and pooled around his shoulders, fabric slipping around him like a veil. Forget you ever saw me." He spit, turning to flee. The doorknob had barely turned in his hand before the other reached him, his grip tight around the wrist he captured. The taller man crowded into his space, trapping him against the door soundly as his other hand came up to push the excess fabric of his hood away from his throat. Izuku flinched as fingertips grazed against the bruises, blooming, eyes darting around the area looking for an escape route. "Which hero did this, Aizu?" Dabi's tone was barely restrained rage, eyes trained on the teen with an intensity that made him feel safe and terrified all at once. "I'm gonna burn that school to the ground, I swear to the gods." "It's not like that," Izuku mumbled, relaxing a little as the other's hold on his wrist eased and then finally disappeared. At the quirked brow and pointed look at the marks, he shook his head and tried to move away from the door. "You can't do anything about this." Izuku pushed gently on the other's chest to get him to take a step away before carefully skirting around him and heading deeper into the apartment. The taller one followed him, a worried shadow as he passed through the doorway into the living room. This was one of their more frequently used safe houses, one that Izuku had set up himself from his own funds, so the layout was familiar. He hadn't been lying when he'd said it had been closest, but it was also the one he felt the safest in. It wasn't, his traitorous mind supplied, as cozy or safe feeling as the apartment in the dorms, but he quickly pushed that thought away. He couldn't think like that or he'd cave and crawl right back to his newly found parental units and show them a few reasons to commit murder. Before he could plop down on the sofa, Dabi beat him there and pulled him down next to him. With a grunt, he landed half on the sofa and half in the other's lap. As badly as he was feeling at the moment, he wanted nothing more to curl up, but it was the principle of the matter at this point. Giving a frustrated little growl, he pushed himself away from him and settled himself near the arm of the sofa. "Nua, you don't get cuddle privileges just because you remembered to give a sheet." The teen huffed, pulling his knees up to his chest. "I'm still mad at you." The fire user rolled his eyes and shifted until he was leaning his back against the opposite arm, angling his body so he was facing the teenager. His gaze lingered on his neck, subtle rage still brewing in his eyes. Izuku ignored it and very firmly ignored the way it made him feel warm. He was mad at him, damn it. "Excuse me, I'm the one who should be mad. Last time I saw you before the mall was when you disappeared into that portal to see All for One. I thought you were dead." Dabi's tone was indignant, and for one solid second Izuku wanted to feel bad. The next moment, though, it was overshadowed by the anger that had been simmering underneath the surface since that night. "Thanks for that, by the way, because you opened your mouth I had to answer a ton of questions." He snapped back, curling up tighter and glaring at the man over his knees. Dabi knew how much he hated having to offer information to get himself out of trouble. It seemed like that was all he was doing these days, too. Hell, outside of the earth-shattering information he just dropped on him, he wasn't even sure where he and Katsuki stood. He was pulled out of his thoughts, though, when the man snorted and reached out to tug at the sleeve of his hoodie. "Yes, Because I was thinking clearly after seeing you all cozied up with your precious kaken while wearing my clothes. Dabi's sneer was angry and as petty as the words were. It made Izuku want to reach out and punch him. He probably would have if he didn't. Recall having to help the man fix his staples on occasion, and he really didn't feel like dealing with that at the moment. Instead, he mustered up all the anger he had simmering underneath the surface and glared at the man, hands edging in the fabric of his pants. "You're such a child. None of this would have happened if you hadn't abandoned me to go play villain with Shigaraki." He hissed, the part of him he didn't like acknowledging, satisfied with the shame that crossed the man's face for a brief moment. "So yeah, when I got arrested and Nizu came knocking, I decided this may as well happen since I had nothing to keep me here." The word nothing seemed to snap Dabi out of whatever mood he'd been in previously, his head jerking a little as if he'd been slapped. Izuku watched as the fight went out of him little by little until he was slumped against the sofa and frowning unhappily at him. "What? So you're some kind of pet for the heroes to make them feel better about themselves?" The man's tone was bitter, gaze flickering to the bruises he could see peeking over the collar of Izuku's hoodie. "Or better yet, a punching bag? Easy target practice." And as badly as Izuku wanted to be mad at him for the accusation, he couldn't bring himself to. With Dabi's past with heroes and his past with his father, it was no wonder he was suspicious and bitter. But he couldn't let the accusations rest, either. "No, Nizu offered me a job," he said softly, uncurling little by little until he was sitting cross-legged. "These kids are at a disadvantage and you know it. It's my job to protect them from you and your people." The older man snorted and let his head drop against the back of the sofa for a moment, waving his hand in a dismissive motion. "Right. So noble of you. Someone once showed me how to survive out here," Izuku retorted, dropping his gaze down to his hands instead of the man on the other end of the sofa. "There's no one to do that for them. They mean well, from what I can tell, and I can't just let them walk out into the mess the world is right now without preparing them for it." Peeking up at Dabi, he could see the phrasing of his words had struck a chord the way he'd intended it to. There was hesitance in the way he picked his head up to peer at him. There was also that suspicion still, as well. "Please, they have the great and powerful All Might to teach them. Why would they want you?" Izuku winced at the phrasing and the way that the first encounter with All Might in the classroom swam in front of his eyes for a moment. "They defended me against him," he said quietly, lifting up his hands to rub at his eyes quickly to try and clear the image from his mind's eye. "Turns out he's a quirkist piece of shit who demanded I be locked away before I brainwashed the students to the dark side. And all of them pretty much told him where he could shove it." Pulling his hands away from his eyes, he peeked over at Dabi once more only to find him staring at him, with his mouth hanging open a little. He didn't look entirely like he believed him, but that was fine. He could deal with that. If he hadn't lived the entire bizarre encounter, he probably wouldn't believe it, either. Silence fell between them for a few long moments, the teen tugging at a loose thread in the sleeve of his hoodie while the others seemed to contemplate everything Izuku had said. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, though, so Izuku let himself relax a little. Everything between him and Dabi was beyond complicated now, as it had been since the moment Dabi got it in his head that the League was the answer to his endeavor problem. But even with it being complicated and strained, the fire-quirked man was still one of the few people that Izuku trusted wholeheartedly. If he truly needed the man, all he had to do was call. Feeling the man's eyes on him again, he lifted his gaze from his hands and in a breath at the rage simmering in the older's eyes. He'd hoped he'd distracted him from the situation at hand, but apparently not. "You sing their praises, but here you are, in one of your bolt holes with bruises around your neck." Dabi's voice was low and dangerous as he sat up and leaned forward into Izuku's space again. "Tell me who did it, Aizu, and I'll make sure they don't have a hand to put on you ever again." Izuku hated himself for the reaction those words gave him. He hated the fact that his chest felt warm and tears built up behind his eyes. Wasn't he beyond this childish need for comfort and protection? He'd done more than most teens towards protecting himself. He'd built a name for himself in the underground that made people think twice about crossing him or attempting to F him over. But no. Here he was fighting back tears because he'd been too weak to protect himself and was getting emotional over someone wanting to take care of the problem for him. How much lower could he sink here? Pretty damn low, apparently, because he couldn't hold back the floodgate any longer and curled in on himself again with a sob. The tears were hot as they flowed down his cheeks, and he hated himself for it. So lost in his pain and misery, he almost didn't register the fact that Dobby had reached out for him, gently pulling him into his lap and tucking him under his chin. Once his brain caught up with what was going on, one of his hands came up to curl into the fabric of the other's jacket and hold onto it for dear life. He couldn't make out anything the man was saying, but his voice soothed him a little, one of the scarred man's hands coming up to card through his hair gently. For a brief moment, he was that kid who jumped again. He was that kid again being told that he mattered, and he didn't have to go back to the life that brought him nothing but pain. This was why he could never stay mad at Dobby, no matter the bone-headed sheet he pulled. Yes, he was angry and hurt that the man decided to join up with the person he hated most in the world. Had been scared of being on his own the first actual time in his life, and carried all of the anger that it inspired still. But everything they'd been through together made it impossible for him to not forgive it so they could move on. If he wanted to look closer at that feeling, it was also the same kind of thing he had with Kakin. These two were just people he couldn't survive without, somehow. Was it healthy? Not a chance. Did he care? Not really. He couldn't tell you if it took an hour or a few minutes for his sobs to slow or his eyes to dry finally. He was so exhausted, physically and mentally, that all he could do was let himself relax against Dobby and let his eyes close finally. The man was still petting his hair, quiet now as if he'd run out of words at some point. Izuku could hear the other's heartbeat beneath his ear and relaxed further listening to it. It was familiar and soothing all at once to know that Dobby was alive and here with him. As much as he didn't want to admit it, he missed the feeling of being absolutely certain of that fact. It was all might. Izuku's voice was barely a whisper as he said it, fingers clenching around Dobby's jacket tighter. The man's questioning hum resonated through his chest and echoed in Izuku's ear as he grasped at the strands of his courage before they disintegrated. My neck, it was all might. His voice shook a little as he resisted the urge to curl into a ball once more. I basically laid all of the information out in front of the class about what he did that day, and when Kakin and Shudo figured it out, he attacked me. Seems to think I've got some mission from All for One to corrupt the children. Dobby's entire body was tense by the time Izuku was done speaking, and he wasn't sure if it was from the information he'd just dumped in his lap or at the mention of his brother. The silence was heavy the longer it dragged on, but Izuku was too exhausted to pick his head up and try and figure out exactly what the other was thinking. Shudo figured it out first? Dobby's voice held a note of pride in it, not that the burned man would ever admit it out loud. The question drew a small chuckle from the teen as he shifted a little to get more comfortable against Dobby's chest. Yeah, he basically told Kakin to stop being an idiot. There aren't a lot of people who can create wind pressure with just a punch. Dobby hummed again, hands slipping out of Izuku's hair to rub over his back gently. They lapsed into silence again, this time comfortable in each other's presence like they hadn't been in months. If Izuku didn't think too hard, it could almost be just like none of the bad had ever happened. That I can try and kill All Might for you if you want. What's one more top hero? Dobby said after a little while, his words breaking through the sleepy haze that was taking over Izuku's thoughts. Nah, I think Shoyuta is gonna do that for you. The teen responded, jaw cracking a little as he yawned after the words were out of his mouth. It drew a snort from the man and Izuku flipped him off, groaning as he shifted again in an attempt to get comfortable. Shoyuta? As in Aizawa Shoyuta, Eraserhead? Dobby's voice was amused and teasing as he shifted them both so that he was stretched out on the sofa and Izuku was laying on top of him. Es my dad now. The teen mumbled, nuzzling his face into Dobby's shirt sleepily and settling finally. I call him Dadzawa in my head. Don't tell him, though, he'll find it offensive. I absolutely am not telling him anything, Aizu. Now go to sleep. K touchin'? The villain just laughed quietly and dragged his fingers through Izuku's hair, luring him deeper and deeper into the haze that was settling over his thoughts. He almost wanted to fight against sleep in an attempt to soak up as much of the time he was going to get like this with Dobby, but the exhaustion of the day pulled at his mind. He could have sworn as he went under finally that he felt Dobby's lips press against the top of his head in a light kiss, but when he awoke, he wouldn't remember the fleeting feeling.